There is a silence that precedes catastrophe. It is not the silence of peace, nor the silence of rest. It is the silence of held breath, the silence of a world pausing at the edge of something terrible and irreversible. In the ancient land of Egypt, a land of towering monuments and golden gods, a land threaded through by the green and ageless Nile, that silence descended one day without warning, without trumpet blast, without ceremony. It arrived in the form of a new king, a man whose name history has obscured, whose face no monument celebrates with honesty, whose rise to power was simply recorded in the pages of the oldest story ever told as this. A new Pharaoh arose over Egypt, one who did not know Joseph. 6 words. One who did not know Joseph. And in those 6 words the fate of an entire people shifted. To understand what happens next, you must understand what came before. You must travel back across the long corridor of memory to a time when a young man with a coat of many colours was thrown into a pit by his own brothers, sold to slave traders for 20 pieces of silver, carried into Egypt in chains, falsely accused, imprisoned, forgotten, and then, against every rational expectation, elevated. Joseph, the 11th son of Jacob, the great-grandson of Abraham, rose from the dungeon of Egypt to the right hand of Pharaoh himself. Through the gift of divine interpretation, through wisdom given to him not by study but by grace, Joseph had predicted the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine that would follow. He had prepared Egypt so thoroughly, so brilliantly, that when the famine struck and the whole known world stumbled towards starvation, Egypt alone had bread. His own brothers came, bowing, hungry, not recognizing the man they had sold. And Joseph, and this is the part that stops the breath, Joseph forgave them. He revealed himself, wept, embraced them, and brought his entire family down to Egypt. His father Jacob, now called Israel, made that journey in old age, and his family, 70 souls in total, settled in the region of Goshen, the green and fertile land of the Nile Delta. They were welcomed, they were protected, they prospered. That was the beginning of the Hebrew people in Egypt, and for a long time, generations stretching across the horizon, the descendants of Joseph's family continued to grow. They multiplied in Goshen, the way seeds multiply in good soil. They had children, and their children had children, and their children's children filled the land. They were not merely surviving, they were flourishing. The text of Exodus tells us, with an urgency that reads almost like alarm, that the Israelites were fruitful and increased greatly, and multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. This is the moment when the new Pharaoh looks up. He does not remember Joseph. He does not carry the gratitude of his ancestors toward the Hebrew dreamer who saved Egypt. Perhaps he was never taught the history, or perhaps he chose not to remember it, not out of ignorance, but out of something more deliberate. Fear has a way of rewriting history. Fear has a way of turning gratitude into resentment, and resentment into policy. And what Pharaoh saw when he looked out across the land of Egypt was not a people who had helped his nation survive. What he saw was a threat. He said to his people, and this is preserved almost word for word in the oldest manuscripts, that the people of Israel were too many and too mighty, and that Egypt must deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply and if war breaks out join the enemies and fight against the nation and escape from the land. There is something deeply human in that fear. It is not an unfamiliar calculation. A people who are numerous, who are strong, who are different, who live in your land but are not of your culture. They could, in the logic of fear, become a danger from within. They could, in the worst imagining, turn against you in the moment of your greatest vulnerability. Pharaoh's fear was not irrational in the clinical sense. It was the fear of a powerful man who understood power, who understood numbers, who understood what a large and growing population could mean for political stability. What made his fear monstrous was not its existence, but what he chose to do with it. He chose to enslave them, not exile, not negotiation, not any attempt to absorb them more fully into Egyptian culture, or to build bridges across the divide of difference. He chose the most brutal possible solution: crush them under labour so backbreaking that their bodies would not have the strength to multiply, and if that failed, well, then other measures would be taken. And this is where our story truly begins, not with Moses parting the sea, not with the 10 plagues darkening the sky. Our story begins earlier, quieter, in a place most sermons rush past and most scholars skip over. Our story begins with 2 women. Their names were Shiphrah and Puah, and before Moses could live, they had to choose. The taskmasters arrived first. Before the explicit command, before the royal decree, before anything was committed to the permanence of law, Pharaoh sent men whose job it was to break people. Egyptian overseers moved into the community of the Israelites in Goshen, with the authority of the crown behind them and the lash at their sides. The work they assigned was not work in the ordinary sense. It was not the honest labour of craftsmen or farmers or builders with adequate food and rest and fair compensation. It was something designed specifically to diminish, to reduce, to take a human being and compress him into an instrument, to wring from a body every ounce of productivity while feeding it just enough to keep it functional. They built store cities. The text of Exodus names 2 of them specifically, Pithom and Ramesses. These were not small projects. Store cities in ancient Egypt were enormous logistical undertakings, vast complexes of granaries and warehouses designed to hold the agricultural surplus of empire, ready to be distributed or mobilized in times of war or famine. The sheer scale of the construction required tens of thousands of workers, mountains of mud brick, the constant churning of the Nile clay into building material, the endless carrying and stacking and laying of those bricks under the Egyptian sun. The sun in that part of the world is not a gentle thing. In the summer months it arrives like a judgment, pressing down from a sky bleached of all colour, radiating from the stone and the sand and the baked earth, until the air itself seems solid with heat. To work in it, not for a day or a week, but year after year, without end, without hope of release, without the dignity of choice, was to exist in a condition that the modern world has a single word for: slavery. The Israelites were slaves, and yet, and this is the detail that Exodus emphasizes with almost pointed irony, they kept multiplying. The very thing Pharaoh had enslaved them to prevent was the thing that would not stop. The text says that the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad. You can imagine the reports reaching Pharaoh's court, the census numbers, the population estimates, the growing count of Hebrew men capable of bearing arms, each new figure more alarming than the last, each new figure tightening the knot of paranoia around the throne. Pharaoh's solution was to make the work harder. The Egyptians were ruthless in the labour they imposed. The word used in the original Hebrew text, perek, carries a meaning that goes beyond ordinary hardship. It implies crushing, grinding, breaking down labour. Labour designed not just to extract value, but to destroy the one performing it. Every brick they made, every stone they moved, every straw they gathered and mixed into clay was part of a programme of calculated suffering, a policy of managed degradation. And still the Israelites grew. There is something almost supernatural about this, and the text of Exodus seems to present it exactly that way, as evidence of a divine counterpressure, a silent force operating against the programs of empire. Pharaoh pushes down and something lifts up. He increases the suffering, and the people increase in number. He builds store cities and they build families. He plans their diminishment and they multiply toward their destiny. This pattern will repeat throughout the Exodus story, but it is here, in these early chapters, that it first becomes visible, and Pharaoh, unable to understand it and unwilling to accept it, escalates. He makes bricks from mud. He cannot seem to make anything from the Israelites but more Israelites. So he changes his approach entirely. He calls in 2 midwives. Their names, remarkably, are preserved. In a text full of anonymous pharaohs and unnamed officials, these 2 women are given names that have echoed across 3,000 years: Shiphrah and Puah. The name Shiphrah carries the meaning of brightness, of beauty, of something that gleams. Puah carries associations with splendour, with the cry of a child, with the act of giving voice. These are not the names of powerful women by the standards of their world. They are not queens or priestesses or noble women. They are midwives. They are the women who kneel in the dark hours before dawn in the rooms where life arrives, who guide new human beings into the world with their hands, who carry within them the ancient and intimate knowledge of birth. That Pharaoh should call them at all tells you something about his desperation. That what he asks them tells you everything about his evil. Picture the throne room of Pharaoh's palace. The columns are vast beyond imagining. Limestone monoliths painted in the deep blues and golds and reds of Egyptian iconography. Images of gods and battles and harvests covering every surface. The floor is polished stone, and your footsteps echo in the enormous silence of the chamber. At the far end, elevated on a dais that places him above ordinary sight, sits the Pharaoh of Egypt. He is not merely a king. In the theology of his own people, he is a god incarnate, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the son of Ra, the living link between the divine order and the human world. To stand before him is to stand before a being who theoretically answers to no one on earth. And into this chamber, Shiphrah and Puah are brought, 2 women, Hebrew women at that. Women who work not in palaces but in homes, not with sceptres but with water and linen and the steady knowledge of their hands. They stand in the most powerful room in the most powerful nation on earth, before a man whose word is law, whose command is destiny, and they listen. Pharaoh's command is simple. It can be summarised in a few words, though the horror of it takes considerably longer to absorb. When you're attending Hebrew women in labour, he tells them, watch carefully. When the child is born, if it is a daughter, let her live. If it is a son, kill him. Let that land for a moment. The king of Egypt has just commanded 2 midwives to become executioners. He has asked the women whose entire vocation is to bring life into the world to become, instead, the agents of its destruction. He has not sent soldiers. He has not issued a public decree. He has chosen precisely these women because their access is intimate and their actions are invisible. A midwife who kills a child in the chaos of labour can always claim the birth went wrong. The infant was weak, the cord was tangled. These things happen. No one in that room but the mother, and who would believe the hysterical grief of a slave woman, would ever know it is a private genocide, quiet, bureaucratic in its way, an administrative solution to a demographic problem, the kind of evil that has no dramatic music, no obvious villain twirling a cape, just a calm and calculated instruction delivered in a throne room, requiring only that 2 ordinary women comply. The question Pharaoh never seems to have asked, the question that will undo him, is what kind of women Shiphrah and Puah actually are. He categorised them. He saw their role, their utility, their access. He did not see their souls. He did not reckon with the fact that there exists a loyalty older and deeper than any throne, a fear more fundamental than the fear of earthly power, a law that supersedes the law of any king. Pharaoh looked at these 2 women and saw instruments. He did not see women who feared God. They left the throne room, they returned to their work, and they did not obey him, not once, not with a single child. The midwives feared God, the text says, and they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. The simplicity of that sentence contains within it one of the most consequential acts of moral courage in the entire biblical narrative. They did not do as the king commanded, 6 words that stood against the full weight of Egyptian imperial power, 6 words that preserved a generation, 6 words that made possible everything that followed. We do not know what went through their minds in the days and weeks and months that followed. We do not have their letters, their prayers, their private conversations at night when the weight of what they were doing must have pressed down on them like the Egyptian sun. We can only imagine. We can only try to understand what it means to carry that kind of secret, to perform that kind of resistance day after day, to look into the face of a newborn boy and choose, against the direct command of the most powerful man in your world to let him breathe. The fear of God is a phrase that modern ears sometimes hear incorrectly. It sounds like terror. It sounds like the same cowering submission that Pharaoh was banking on. But the fear of God that the Hebrew scriptures describe is something entirely different in kind. It is not the fear of punishment, though punishment is real. It is the fear of a child who loves a parent, the deep reluctance to disappoint, to violate, to betray the relationship. It is the recognition that there is a moral reality higher and more permanent than any human authority, and that to violate it is to lose something more essential than safety, or comfort, or even life. Shiphrah and Puah feared God. That fear was not a weakness. It was the foundation of their courage. You cannot be truly brave by accident. Bravery requires that you understand the risk and choose anyway, and these women understood the risk completely. Pharaoh's punishment for defiance was not a fine or a demotion. Pharaoh's punishment was death. They chose anyway. They let the boys live. They went to the next birth, and the next, and the next, carrying their secret in their hands like something holy. There is a question that has been asked about Shiphrah and Puah across thousands of years of interpretation and scholarship and sermon and midnight prayer. What exactly did they understand about what they were doing? Did they fully grasp, in the moment Pharaoh spoke his command, the complete moral landscape of the choice before them? Did they see, with the clarity of philosophers, the collision of loyalties to the earthly king who commanded them and the heavenly king who made them? Did they spend agonizing nights in debate, rehearsing arguments, weighing outcomes, consulting their community? Or was it simpler than that? Was it the immediate, visceral, pre-rational refusal of a woman who has spent her life calling forth new life to be the instrument of its extinction? We cannot know. The text does not give us access to their inner lives. It gives us only their action, and then their words when that action is called into question. But we can think about the moral structure of the decision they made, because that structure illuminates not just their choice, but a principle that runs through the entire biblical narrative and beyond it, into every century of human history where the same collision has occurred. Obedience to authority is not, in the biblical worldview, a trivial virtue. It is genuinely important. The societies in which human beings flourish are societies with stable structures of order, with laws that are followed, with hierarchies that are respected, with institutions that function because people within them do what they are told. The New Testament, written 15 centuries after Exodus, will explicitly instruct believers to submit to governing authorities, recognizing them as established by God. The Hebrew wisdom literature is full of counsel about respecting kings, honouring those in power, avoiding the chaos that comes from every person becoming their own law. Obedience matters. But obedience is not the highest value in the biblical moral order. It is a derivative value. It draws its weight from the assumption that the authority being obeyed is itself answerable to something higher, that the law of the land is at least roughly consonant with the law of the God who made the land. When that assumption breaks down, when the earthly command and the divine command move in opposite directions, a choice must be made, and the biblical narrative is consistent about which choice must prevail. When the Hebrew midwives choose to let the babies live, they are not acting in rebellion against the concept of order. They are acting in submission to a deeper order, an order that precedes Pharaoh and will outlast him, an order that says every human life is precious, that children are not threats to be managed but gifts to be received, that the command to kill the innocent is not a legitimate exercise of authority, but a corruption of it. This is not a comfortable principle. It would be much simpler if authority were always trustworthy, if the commands of earthly power were always consistent with divine justice, if obedience and righteousness never came into conflict. But they do. They have throughout history, and every generation must wrestle with what to do when they collide. Shiphrah and Puah did not write a theological treatise. They did not publish a manifesto. They simply went to the next birth, and the next, and they let the boys live. Their resistance was not dramatic. It had none of the visible heroism that we tend to celebrate. No marches, no speeches, no public confrontation. It was quiet, hidden, done in the dark rooms where birth happens, witnessed only by labouring mothers and the God who sees everything. Consider the texture of their daily lives during this period. They are known in their community. They move through the Hebrew neighbourhoods of Goshen, recognised, trusted, called for when labour begins. Women in pain reach for them. Families admit them to the most vulnerable moments of their existence. And Shiphrah and Puah arrive carrying their skill and their secret. They deliver the child. It is a boy. And in that moment, the moment when, had they obeyed Pharaoh, they would act. They do not act. They wrap the child. They place him in his mother's arms. They do not speak of what they have refused to do, perhaps, or perhaps they do speak of it, in whispers, in the private language of women who are guarding a community together. We do not know. What we know is that this continued long enough for Pharaoh to notice that his program was not working. The Hebrew boys kept appearing. The population of male children in Goshen was not decreasing. The demographic problem that Pharaoh was trying to solve through Shiphrah and Puah was emphatically not being solved. And eventually, inevitably, Pharaoh summoned them again. This is the moment the narrative has been building toward. This is the moment that tests whether the courage of Shiphrah and Puah is real. Not a single flash of instinctive defiance, but something sustained and deliberate and prepared. Pharaoh calls them before him. He demands an explanation. His question carries the weight of royal displeasure and the implicit threat of royal punishment. Why have you done this thing and let the male children live? Two women standing before the embodied power of the ancient world's greatest empire are asked to explain why they have defied the crown, and they answer. Their answer has been discussed and debated and analysed from every possible angle for 3,000 years. It is possible to read it as straightforwardly factual, an accurate description of a real difference in childbirth practices between Hebrew and Egyptian women. It is possible to read it as a clever and calculated evasion, a technically true statement designed to mislead without lying outright. It is possible to read it as a kind of holy wisdom, the same category of action as Rahab hiding the spies in Jericho, or any of the many other moments in the biblical narrative where the moral calculus permits what ordinary ethics would call a difficult truth in service of a higher one. Across the centuries, theologians have taken different positions, and the debate itself is instructive, because it shows that the ancient world did not sanitize its heroes. What Shiphrah and Puah say is this: Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. The word translated as vigorous, shayot in the Hebrew, is itself a kind of word play. It can mean full of life, lively, strong. But it is related to the word for animal, for creature, for the wild and vital energy of living things. In other words, these Hebrew women are like wild animals in their births, quick and powerful, over before we can arrive. There is no time for us to be present. By the time we get there, the child is already born. Whether this was literally true, whether Hebrew women did in fact tend toward shorter labours than Egyptian women, possibly due to the physical conditioning of hard labour, possibly due to other factors, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. What can be said is that Pharaoh cannot disprove it. He has no counter-evidence. He cannot call Hebrew women before him and conduct some kind of investigation into the speed of their deliveries. He has only the word of two women who have spent more time in the birthrooms of Goshen than any soldier or official in his court, and so he accepts their answer, or rather, he cannot reject it. He has nowhere to put his suspicion. He cannot prove they are lying, and perhaps some part of him, some pragmatic part of the royal mind, accepts the possibility that they are telling the truth. They walk out. The babies live. The sheer audacity of this is almost too large to hold. Two midwives stood before the Pharaoh of Egypt and responded with words that protected themselves and the children they had saved, and they walked out of the throne room alive. We do not know if they trembled. We do not know if their voices held or wavered, if they looked at the floor or met the royal gaze, if they had rehearsed their answer or found it in the moment with a presence of mind that surprised even themselves. We know only that they spoke and they walked away, and the babies lived. Their courage was not the courage of certainty. No one in that position is certain. They could not have known, walking into that throne room, what Pharaoh would do with their answer. They could not have calculated the outcome in advance. They went in not knowing if they would come out, and they said what they said, and God, the text makes clear what happens next, was with them. The text of Exodus pauses its grand narrative of national deliverance to record something intimate and precise. It says, because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. This is remarkable in several ways. First, it is a direct causal statement. Because they did this thing, God did that thing. The connection is explicit, personal, and immediate. The God of Israel did not merely allow history to unfold in a way that was eventually favourable to those who obeyed him. He noticed. He responded. He acted specifically toward these two women in proportion to their specific act of faith and courage. Second, the reward itself is significant. He gave them families. In the Hebrew, he built them houses. In the language and culture of that time and place, a house was more than a building. It was a dynasty, a lineage, a legacy. To be given a house was to be given continuity, descendants who would carry your name and your story forward. It was the thing that ancient people feared most to lose. Childlessness was not merely a personal sorrow, but a kind of extinction, a being written out of the future. And the two women who had spent their lives ensuring that other families had children were given the gift of children of their own. There is a beautiful symmetry in this that deserves to be held and turned slowly. Shiphrah and Puah gave life to others at enormous personal risk, and God gave life to them in return. They preserved families when the command of empire demanded that families be destroyed, and the God of those families preserved their own. It is the kind of correspondence that the biblical narrative finds meaningful, not coincidence, but pattern. The moral order of a universe in which what you do to others shapes what comes to you. The Israelites continued to multiply. The text notes this with the same insistent energy it has used throughout, the same almost incredulous report of unstoppable growth. The program of infanticide, never publicly declared, conducted in the shadows of the birthroom, has utterly failed. The demographic problem that kept Pharaoh awake at night has gotten worse, not better. And the instrument of his failed plan, two women who feared God more than they feared the crown, have been blessed with families of their own, their names written into the oldest book in the world, their courage preserved in the memory of every generation that has read this story. Consider what their ordinary lives looked like in the wake of their reward. Shiphrah, whose name means brightness, moving through the community of Goshen with her own children following behind her, attending the births of neighbours and friends, her hands still skilled, her presence still trusted, her secret still held close and holy in her heart. Puah, whose name carries the sound of a child's first cry, receiving that cry again and again in the birthrooms of her people, now with the added dimension of knowing that her own children are alive because she refused to silence the cries of others. These are not abstract theological figures. They are women who lived and worked and raised families and grew old, whose choices had consequences that rippled out across generations. And the multiplication of Israel continued, quietly, in the homes and the fields of Goshen, in the dark hours of labour and the bright hours of new life. The population grew, the community deepened, and somewhere in that multiplying community, in a particular family of the tribe of Levi, a woman named Jochebed was pregnant. Her child would change the world, but he would not be here without Shiphrah and Puah. Pharaoh was not a man who accepted failure graciously. When the quiet plan of the midwives failed, when it became unmistakably, undeniably clear that the Hebrew male population was not decreasing, that the covert program of infanticide had somehow yielded no results, that the two women he had trusted to carry out his decree had, in the most spectacular possible way, not carried it out. He did not reflect. He did not reconsider. He did not wonder whether the approach itself was wrong, whether there might be a different way to understand this situation, whether the God of the Israelites was perhaps sending him a message in the form of persistent demographic resilience. None of that. Pharaoh escalated. He went public. The command that had been whispered in a throne room to two women, carefully contained and concealed, strategically private, that command was now broadcast. It was expanded. It was extended beyond the midwives, beyond any professional class, beyond any single point of control to the entire population of Egypt. Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile. Every daughter you shall let live." Read that again, slowly. Every Egyptian person, from the highest official to the lowest servant, was now a participant in Pharaoh's program of genocide. Every Egyptian neighbour of a Hebrew family was now, in theory, a potential informer, an enforcer, an instrument of death. Every birth in Goshen now happened under the shadow not just of a secret royal order, but of open national policy. Every Hebrew mother who gave birth to a son now held in her arms a child that the law of the land commanded to be drowned. The Nile, that great, eternal, life-giving river that had sustained the civilization of Egypt since before memory. The Nile that flooded every year and left behind the rich black silt that made Egypt's fields the most productive in the ancient world. The Nile that the Egyptians venerated as a divine gift, source of all their prosperity and power. That Nile was now to be a grave. There is a terrible irony in this that the narrative of Exodus eventually makes explicit. Pharaoh chose the Nile as his instrument of death, and the Nile would become the instrument of his defeat. The river he commanded to receive the bodies of Hebrew infant boys would instead carry one of those boys, hidden in a basket of reeds, placed there by a mother who refused to submit to despair, to the very household of Pharaoh. Moses would be drawn from the water by Pharaoh's own daughter. Moses would grow up in Pharaoh's own house. The mechanism of destruction became the mechanism of deliverance. But that comes later. In the moment of the escalated decree, what matters is the darkness of it. The previous command, terrible as it was, had the quality of something that could at least be resisted through the specific courage of specific individuals. Shiphrah and Puah could defy a private order, but a public decree commanding all of Egypt was a different animal entirely. Every Hebrew family with a newborn son was now in mortal danger. Every moment of joy at a birth was immediately shadowed by terror. Every name given to a boy child was a name given to a fugitive. This is the world into which Moses was born. This is the context in which Jochebed, his mother, looked at her son for 3 months and refused to surrender him to the river that waited outside. This is the desperation that led her to build the basket, to waterproof it with pitch and tar, to place her baby inside and set him among the reeds at the river's edge, to position his sister Miriam nearby to watch. She was doing what Shiphrah and Puah had done, refusing in the face of imperial command to be the agent of a child's death. She was doing what they had done, finding in the space between the demand and the action a way to let life continue. The midwives' refusal had delayed the genocide. Their courage had brought months, perhaps years, of protected births in Goshen. Every boy who lived because of their defiance was a boy who grew up to be part of the people that God was preserving for his purposes. The population that would eventually leave Egypt in the Exodus, that enormous, staggering company of souls, was larger, stronger, more vital because of 2 women who said no to Pharaoh in the quiet dark of the birth room. Shiphrah and Puah never met Moses. They may have been old women by the time he was born, or they may have been gone entirely. We do not know. But the world into which Moses was born was shaped by their choices. The community that produced him, sustained him, remembered him when Pharaoh's own household had formed him. That community existed in the form it did because of them. History rarely moves in straight lines. It moves in the complicated, overlapping trajectories of thousands of individual decisions, most of them unrecognized at the time, most of them made by people who did not know they were shaping anything larger than the immediate moment in front of them. Shiphrah and Puah were not trying to set the stage for the Exodus. They were not calculating the downstream effects of their defiance on the trajectory of Israelite history. They were simply doing what their conscience and their God required of them, one birth at a time, and trusting that the rest was not their business to manage. And yet, there is a category of hero that history tends to forget. Not the conquerors, not the kings, not the prophets whose words thunder across centuries, not the military commanders whose victories get carved into stone. The forgotten heroes are the ones who acted before the story had a stage, who laid the foundation beneath the foundation, who made the great moments possible without ever being present in them. Shiphrah and Puah belong to this category. After Exodus chapter 1, they are never mentioned again. The camera of the narrative moves on. Moses is born and hidden and discovered and raised in the palace, and called by God in the burning bush, and sent back to Egypt and given his brother Aaron as a spokesman, and begins the great negotiation with Pharaoh, the plague-by-plague dismantling of Egyptian confidence and Egyptian power, the Passover, the crossing of the sea, the giving of the law at Sinai, the 40 years in the wilderness. All of it unfolds across hundreds of chapters and dozens of books, and Shiphrah and Puah are not in any of it. Not a reference, not a mention, not a single sentence that says, and those midwives, the ones who started all this, here is what became of them. They are given their reward. Families, houses, a future, and then they fade from the text, and yet their names are there. In the oldest chapters of the oldest book of the oldest continuously practiced religious tradition on earth, the names Shiphrah and Puah are written down. The name of the Pharaoh who commanded them is not there. This is a historical reality that would have astonished the court of Egypt, whose entire civilization was built around the project of making royal names permanent, whose monuments, whose obelisks, whose elaborate hieroglyphic inscriptions were all in service of ensuring that the name of Pharaoh would never die. The Pharaoh of the oppression invested enormous resources in making his name immortal. He built cities, he erected monuments, he inscribed his achievements in stone that was meant to stand forever. His name is not in the story. Shiphrah's is, Puah's is. The inversion is so complete, so perfect, so exactly opposite to what any rational observer of the ancient world would have predicted, that it reads like a statement, like a message, like the universe itself recording its opinion of who mattered, whose choices were worth preserving, whose story needed to be told. There are no monuments to these two women anywhere in Egypt. No temples bear their names, no official records, no administrative papyrus, no royal inscription acknowledges their existence. If the text of Exodus were lost, if those particular chapters had been destroyed in one of history's many conflagrations, Shiphrah and Puah would be as unknown as the Pharaoh who commanded them, which is to say, unknown completely, swallowed by time, their names and their courage and their consequence erased without trace. But the text was not lost. It survived. It was copied and recopied and translated and transmitted across 3,000 years, hand to hand, generation to generation, through the destruction of the temple and the Babylonian captivity, and the dispersion of the Jewish people across the known world, and the rise of Christianity and the spread of Islam and the printing press and the Industrial Revolution and the digital age. The story of Shiphrah and Puah has been read in synagogues and churches and homes and classrooms on every continent, in hundreds of languages, by billions of people, across the entire span of recorded human civilization. They thought they were just keeping babies alive. They were keeping alive the story of everything. The generation that Shiphrah and Puah preserved was the generation of Moses, and Moses was the figure through whom the law was given. Not just the 10 Commandments inscribed on stone tablets at Sinai, but the entire legal and moral framework that would become the foundation of Western civilization's concept of justice. The idea that every human being has inherent dignity, that the powerful are accountable to something higher than their own power, that there is a moral law binding on everyone regardless of status. These ideas were transmitted through Moses, refined through the prophets, carried into the New Testament, woven into the foundations of modern legal and ethical thinking. You cannot draw a straight line from Shiphrah and Puah to every great declaration of human rights that followed, but you can draw a winding, indirect, historically continuous line, and those two women are at its beginning. No monuments, no temples, no inscriptions, just two names, just the fact that they let the babies live. The theological principle at the centre of this story is one that the biblical tradition returns to again and again, with the insistence of something that cannot be simplified away. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. This phrase, which appears in Proverbs and Psalms and Job and throughout the wisdom literature, is not an invitation to cower. It is a moral compass. It is an orientation, a way of locating yourself in relation to what is ultimately real and ultimately authoritative. The person who fears God has found a fixed point, a reference point that does not move with political winds or social pressure or the commands of the powerful. Because they have that fixed point, they can navigate. They know true north even when every other compass in the room is spinning. Pharaoh represented a kind of authority that was total in its claims. Egyptian theology did not divide neatly into sacred and secular, spiritual and political, divine and human. Pharaoh was the bridge between those categories. His word was law because he was, in some profound theological sense, the law, the embodiment of cosmic order in human form, the representative of the divine on earth, the one through whom the will of the gods was exercised. To defy Pharaoh was not merely to break a civil law. It was, in Egyptian theological terms, to rebel against the divine order itself. Shiphrah and Puah were operating with a different theology. Their understanding of divine order placed it not in the person of any earthly king, but in the character of a god who had specific, binding, non-negotiable commitments to justice and to life. The God they feared, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God who had made a covenant with their people and promised them a future, was not a God who commanded the murder of children. He was a God who had repeatedly demonstrated his preference for life, for the vulnerable, for the widow and the orphan and the stranger. The command to kill the infant boys was not, in the moral logic of Shiphrah and Puah, a legitimate exercise of divine authority. It was a corruption of authority, a misuse of power, an action that placed Pharaoh in direct opposition to the God who had given him, as he had given all rulers, whatever legitimate authority he possessed. And so the women who feared God defied the man who claimed to be a god, because only one of those claims was true. This is the logic of biblical moral courage, and it is a logic that has been applied in every century since. The Hebrew midwives are the first explicit example in Scripture of what the New Testament apostles would later articulate directly. We must obey God rather than men. They are the prototype of every person of faith who has ever stood firm for their conscience, who has ever sheltered the vulnerable from unjust law, who has ever refused a command that violated everything they knew to be true about the God who made them. The people of conscience in every century who have looked at the command of earthly authority and said, quietly, firmly, without drama, no, not this, not us. They all stand in the line of Shiphrah and Puah, not because those midwives were perfect or their situation was simple or their choices were without ambiguity, but because they understood the thing that all genuine moral courage requires, that some things matter more than personal safety, that there is a loyalty that supersedes all lesser loyalties, that when the voice of the king and the voice of God move in opposite directions, there is ultimately only one voice worth following. The fear of God is not weakness. It is the only courage that lasts. There is a pattern in the biblical narrative that is so consistent it can almost be called a law. God chooses the unexpected instrument. The younger brother over the elder, the shepherd boy over the warrior king, the barren woman over the fruitful one, the stammering voice over the eloquent one. Again and again, the story of God's action in the world involves reaching past the obvious, the powerful, the credentialed, the impressive, and choosing instead the person that everyone else has either overlooked or dismissed. Shiphrah and Puah fit this pattern perfectly. They were women in a world where women had almost no formal power. They were Hebrews in a land where their people were slaves. They were midwives, not priests, not prophets, not judges, not commanders. They held no office. They commanded no armies. They had no access to the mechanisms of political or military or religious power. By every conventional measure of influence and importance in the ancient world, they were exactly the wrong people to shape the course of history. And they shaped the course of history. The pattern matters because it is instructive. It tells us something about where to look for the people who are actually doing the most important work in any given era. Not always in the palaces, not always in the positions of recognised authority, not always in the places where power is formally held. Sometimes, often, the most consequential choices are being made in the birthrooms of Goshen by women whose names will never appear on a monument, who will never know the full scope of what they have done, who are simply doing what their God requires of them in the particular small corner of the world where they have been placed. This is an extraordinarily hopeful truth. It means that ordinary people, people without formal power, without prestigious positions, without the ability to pass legislation or lead armies or command resources, are capable of acts with world historical consequences. It means that the choice you make in the dark when no one is watching, when there is no audience and no applause and no recognition, can matter more than the choices of kings. It means that faithfulness in the small, specific, unremarkable task that is yours, doing it with integrity, with the fear of God as your compass, with the willingness to pay the cost when the cost is demanded, that faithfulness is not insignificant. It is not merely a private virtue, it reverberates. The two midwives of Goshen shaped the life of a prophet, and the prophet shaped the faith of a people, and the faith of a people shaped the conscience of a civilization. All of that, on the other end of a chain whose first link was two women who refused to kill babies. God uses the overlooked. This is not an accident. It is perhaps a preference. The thing that strikes you when you sit with this story long enough is the silence of it. There is no battle. There is no parting sea. There is no pillar of fire leading through the wilderness. There is no voice from the burning bush, no series of miraculous plagues, no 10 commandments delivered on stone tablets in thunder and lightning. All of that comes later, and it comes with the grandeur that has made it memorable across millennia. But what comes before it, what makes it possible, is this. Two women, in the dark of the birthroom, doing their work, choosing life, saying nothing public about any of it. The courage of Shiphrah and Puah was not loud, it was not performed, it had no audience, it sought no recognition and received none while they lived, or at least none that the historical record has preserved. They were not celebrated in their community as heroes as far as we know. They were not given monuments or titles or official recognition of any kind. They kept their secret, they did their work, they accepted the blessing God gave them, and the world moved on around them without any visible acknowledgement of what they had done. And yet the world was different because of what they had done. The world was different in the most profound possible way. The people of God had been preserved, the line of covenant promise had been protected, the future that God had spoken to Abraham had been kept open, and none of the people who would live in that different world would know, by and large, that these two women were among the reasons for it. This is the ordinary shape of most consequential goodness. It does not announce itself, it does not leave press releases. It happens in the moment that is at hand, in the decision that presents itself, with the courage that is available, and the fear of God that provides direction. And then life continues, and the consequences ripple outward invisibly, and the people who were touched by the choice continue their lives not knowing what was done for them. The babies who lived because Shiphrah and Puah refused Pharaoh's command grew up in Goshen. They learned to work the clay and lay the bricks. They married and had children of their own. They gathered around fires in the evening and told the stories of their ancestors, of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And they waited without knowing they were waiting for something to change. They did not know that their lives specifically had been preserved by a choice made in a birthroom by two women, with skilled hands and unbreakable hearts. They only knew that they were alive. Is that not enough? Is it not enough to be the reason someone is alive, even if they never know it? Is it not enough to do the right thing in the moment that demands it, even if the full scope of its consequence will never be visible to you? The biblical tradition says yes, emphatically, generously, with the kind of certainty that comes from a long memory of how these things tend to work. Yes, it is enough. Do the right thing. Fear God. Let the babies live. The rest is not yours to manage or measure or see. It is late now, wherever you are. The night has settled in, and the world outside is quieter than it was. And perhaps that quietness is something like the quietness of the birth room in Goshen where Shiphrah and Puah worked. That particular charged, intimate silence where new life arrives and choices are made and the future is shaped by hands that no monument will celebrate. Think about what it means that we know their names. 3,000 years ago, in a world that has vanished so completely that we cannot find the palace of the Pharaoh who enslaved the Israelites, in a language that had to be painstakingly recovered by modern scholars, in a community of people who were slaves with no political power and no standing in the great society around them. 2 women did something right. They let the babies live. They stood before the most powerful man in their world and found words enough to walk away from him. They accepted the blessing God gave them and continued their work and lived their lives and died, and their names are still here. Shiphrah, Puah. Say them out loud if you want. Let them exist in the air for a moment. Let them be what they are. The names of 2 women who were afraid and brave at the same time, who feared God more than they feared Pharaoh, who understood, perhaps without ever articulating it philosophically, that there are some commands that cannot be obeyed and some lives that must be protected, and some choices that define not just the moment, but everything that comes after it. The Pharaoh who commanded them built cities. His name is gone. The cities are ruins. The empire is dust and memory and tourist photographs and museum exhibits. The golden masks and the limestone columns and the elaborate burial chambers with their walls of hieroglyphic prayer. All of it, the whole extraordinary apparatus of Egyptian imperial power at its height, has been reduced to the raw material of scholarship. And Shiphrah and Puah are still here. There is something in this that the soul recognizes before the mind can process it. Something that feels like justice. Not the rough approximate justice of courts and laws, but the deeper justice of how things actually are, of what actually lasts, of whose choices actually matter in the long accounting of history. The midwives feared God, and God noticed. The midwives let the babies live, and the babies' descendants carried the story forward. The story carried the names. The names are here. What does this mean for you? Not you in the abstract. You, specifically, listening in whatever particular corner of the world you occupy tonight. You, with your particular set of circumstances and responsibilities and choices that no one else can make for you. You, who may not hold any formal power, who may not be in any position of obvious influence, who may feel that what you do in your ordinary life, in your ordinary place, has no particular significance beyond the immediate. The story of Shiphrah and Puah suggests otherwise. It suggests that the choices made quietly, in the dark, without audience, without recognition, with only the fear of God as compass. Those choices are not small. They are not inconsequential. They ripple outward in ways that cannot be predicted or measured or seen in real time. They reach forward into futures that the person making the choice will never witness. They preserve things, lives, possibilities, futures that would otherwise be lost. The question the story leaves you with is not complicated. It is in fact the simplest possible question, though simple does not mean easy. When the moment comes, and it will come, in whatever form is particular to your life, in whatever context your choices are made, when the moment comes that asks you to choose between what is commanded by earthly authority and what is required by something higher, whose voice will you hear? The midwives heard God's voice. They let the babies live, and 3,000 years later their names are still here, written in the oldest book in the world, preserved in the memory of every people and tradition that has carried this story forward, permanent as anything human hands have ever made. Sometimes the most powerful victories happen quietly, in moments when no one is watching, except God, who always watches, who always remembers, who always, in the fullness of time, writes down the right names. Rest well tonight. Let this story settle into you like water into deep soil, and remember, as you close your eyes, the brightness of Shiphrah and the voice of Puah, two women who chose life when the world chose death, and changed everything without knowing it, and received their reward from the only one whose reward truly lasts. Hey everyone, welcome back to Sacred Slumber. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something that would genuinely help us out. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps the channel more than you possibly know. Seriously, it makes a massive difference in getting these stories out to more people who love this kind of content. Also, if you want to, drop a comment telling us what time it is for you right now and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. No pressure though, only if you feel like it. And of course, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. It keeps us going. Alright, let's get into it. A whisper in the darkness. Imagine a night so quiet you can hear the oil lamps flickering. Picture a massive stone sanctuary in the ancient city of Shiloh, where shadows dance across walls that have witnessed centuries of worship. The air is thick with the scent of incense and burning oil, that peculiar combination of cedar smoke and olive essence that clings to sacred spaces. Outside, the wind moves through the hills of Israel like a whispered prayer, carrying with it the distant bleating of sheep settling for the night and the occasional call of a desert owl. Inside, in the sacred chambers near the Ark of the Covenant, a young boy lies sleeping on a simple mat. The stones beneath him still hold the warmth of the day's sun, though the night air has begun to cool. His breathing is steady, deep, the kind of sleep that comes from honest physical labour and a clear conscience. His name is Samuel. This is not a story about miracles that shake mountains or angels descending in blinding light. This is a story about something quieter, something more intimate, something that happens in the space between waking and dreaming, where the boundaries of reality become permeable. It is about a voice in the darkness, a child who learned to listen when the entire world had gone deaf, and a moment that would alter the spiritual trajectory of an entire nation. Because sometimes the most profound truths do not arrive with thunder and earthquake. Sometimes they do not announce themselves with burning bushes or pillars of fire. Sometimes they arrive in whispers, in the stillness between breaths, in the gentle calling of a name spoken 3 times before it is finally understood. What you're about to hear is one of the most mysterious and beautiful moments in ancient scripture. A moment when heaven reached down to touch earth, not through spectacular signs, but through the simple act of calling a child's name in the night. But it is also a story about silence broken, about the end of a spiritual drought, about what happens when the divine decides to speak again after generations of absence. This is the story of Samuel, the boy who heard God speak when the rest of the world had forgotten how to listen. And perhaps, hidden within this ancient narrative, there are questions we have forgotten to ask. Questions about why heaven goes silent. Questions about who gets chosen to break that silence. Questions about whether the voice that called to Samuel in that darkened sanctuary is still calling, still speaking, still searching for those rare individuals who know how to say, "I am listening." Chapter 1. Hannah's Promise. To understand Samuel's calling, we must first understand how he came to be sleeping in that sanctuary. His story begins not with him, but with his mother, a woman named Hannah, who knew the bitter taste of desperation and the hollow ache of prayers that seemed to vanish into an empty sky. In the hill country of Ephraim, in a small village whose name has been lost to history, there lived a man named Elkanah who had 2 wives, as was common in that era. His first wife, Peninnah, had given him several children, sons to carry his name, daughters to arrange in marriage, a legacy written in flesh and blood. His second wife, Hannah, had given him only heartache and unanswered prayers. Year after year, Hannah remained childless, and in a culture where a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to bear children, this was not just a personal grief. It was a social death sentence, a daily humiliation, a question mark hanging over her entire existence. Neighbours would whisper, extended family would exchange knowing glances, even well-meaning friends would offer useless advice, or suggest that perhaps she had offended God in some way, that her barrenness was divine punishment for some unknown sin. Elkanah loved Hannah. The text makes this clear. He would give her double portions at feasts, trying to compensate with material generosity for what biology had denied her. He would ask her with genuine confusion, "Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" It was a question born of love but blind to understanding. He could not fathom that the issue went deeper than his affection, that Hannah's grief was not about him at all, but about her own sense of purpose, of completion, of being seen as fully human by the society around her. Peninnah, with the cruelty that can only come from insecurity dressed as triumph, would taunt Hannah relentlessly. Every time the family made their annual pilgrimage to the sanctuary at Shiloh to worship and offer sacrifices, Peninnah would remind Hannah of her barrenness. The taunts were not subtle. They were designed to cut deep, to remind Hannah that in the eyes of the world she was incomplete, cursed, forgotten by the very God she came to worship. Peninnah would parade her children before Hannah, would make comments about how blessed she was, would turn every moment of worship into a reminder of Hannah's failure. And Hannah would weep. She would refuse to eat. The pain went beyond physical longing for a child. It touched something deeper, the existential question that haunts anyone who feels overlooked by the divine. Does God see me? Does he hear my prayers? Am I worthy of his attention? Or am I simply background noise in a universe too vast to care about one woman's grief? The pilgrimage to Shiloh was supposed to be a time of joy, of celebration, of renewal. But for Hannah, it became an annual reminder of everything she lacked. Year after year she would go through the motions of worship, while her heart broke quietly in places no one could see. One year, during their pilgrimage to Shiloh, Hannah could bear it no longer. The weight of accumulated grief, the years of disappointment, the constant humiliation, all of it reached a breaking point. While the rest of the family feasted after the sacrifice, celebrating with wine and roasted meat, Hannah slipped away to the entrance of the sanctuary. She stood there, in the place where earth met heaven, in the threshold between the mundane and the sacred, and she prayed with an intensity that went beyond words. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Her whole body shook with the force of her grief and desperation. Tears streamed down her face. Her hands trembled. This was not the polite, ritualized prayer of public worship. This was raw, unfiltered communion with the divine, This was a woman pouring out her soul, holding nothing back, demanding to be heard by a God who had seemed deaf to her pleas for years. She made a vow that day, one that would echo through generations. If God would grant her a son, she would give him back to God. Not for a season, not for a few years, but for his entire life. The child would be dedicated to divine service from the moment he was weaned. It was the prayer of a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is not something to hold on to, but something to offer back to its source. She was not bargaining with God so much as she was declaring her willingness to participate in something larger than her own desires. Eli, the high priest, sat by the doorpost of the sanctuary and watched this strange woman swaying and muttering. In his aging, perhaps cynical view of human nature shaped by years of dealing with corrupt worshippers and his own corrupt sons, he assumed she was drunk. The accusation was harsh, almost cruel. "What are you doing here, intoxicated in the house of the Lord? How dare you bring your drunkenness into this sacred space?" Hannah lifted her eyes, and in them Eli saw not the glaze of wine, but the clarity of absolute desperation, the look of someone who has nothing left to lose, who has stripped away all pretense and pride, who stands naked before God with only their need. She explained that she was not drunk but deeply troubled, pouring out her soul before God. She had been praying out of her great anguish and grief. Something in her words, or perhaps in her eyes, or perhaps in the raw authenticity of her pain, convinced Eli. His response was both blessing and prophecy. "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant what you have asked of him." It is unclear whether Eli knew what he was saying, whether he was simply offering the standard priestly blessing, or whether something moved through him in that moment. Some whisper of the divine speaking through a man who had grown complacent in his religious duties. But the words landed on Hannah like rain on parched earth. Hannah left the sanctuary that day transformed. Her face was no longer downcast. She ate. The grief lifted from her countenance like a fog dispersing under the morning sun. She had been heard, if not by man, then by something infinitely greater. She did not yet have the child she longed for, but she had something perhaps more precious. The certainty that her prayers had reached their destination, that her voice had penetrated the silence, that she mattered to the God she served. Within the year, Hannah conceived. When she gave birth to a son, she named him Samuel, which in Hebrew carries the meaning heard by God, or asked of God, or some translations suggest name of God. The name itself was a testimony, a permanent reminder that this child was an answer to prayer, a gift that came from somewhere beyond the ordinary workings of the world. Every time someone spoke his name, they were acknowledging that this boy represented the moment when heaven responded to earth, when silence gave way to acknowledgement. For the first few years of his life, Samuel remained with Hannah. She nursed him, taught him his first words, held him close during thunderstorms, watched him take his first steps, knowing that each day brought them closer to the moment of separation. She must have memorized the sound of his laugh, the feel of his small hand in hers, the weight of him sleeping against her chest. She was not raising a son to keep, but a son to give away, and that knowledge must have coloured every moment with a bittersweet intensity. When he was old enough to be weaned, somewhere around 3 years old by the customs of that time, Hannah kept her vow. She could have rationalised her way out of it. She could have argued that God understood, that the vow was made in a moment of emotional extremity, that surely keeping her son would be acceptable. But Hannah was a woman who understood that integrity means keeping promises even when they cost you everything. She took Samuel to Shiloh. She brought him before Eli, the same priest who had blessed her years earlier, and she said words that must have torn her heart even as she spoke them. "I am the woman who stood here praying. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." Then Hannah sang, not a lament, but a song of triumph and praise. She sang of God overturning the proud and lifting up the humble. She sang of barren women bearing children and the powerful being brought low. She sang of the Lord bringing death and giving life, bringing down to the grave and raising up. She sang of God judging the ends of the earth, giving strength to his king and exalting his anointed. Her song was radical, revolutionary, a declaration that the God she served delighted in reversing the expectations of the world, in using the weak to shame the strong, in lifting up those the world had written off as irrelevant. And then she left her son in that sanctuary and went home. Imagine being that child, too young to fully understand why your mother brought you to this vast, echoing building filled with strange smells and unfamiliar faces and then walked away. Too young to grasp that you had become the physical embodiment of a promise, a living prayer offered back to its source. You watch her figure receding, growing smaller, disappearing down the road back to the only home you have ever known, and you are left in the care of an old man whose eyes can barely see you, whose own sons are corrupt, in a place that will become your entire world. Samuel's childhood was unlike any other in Israel. While other boys played in fields and learned their father's trades, running through olive groves and swimming in streams, Samuel grew up in the sacred space of the tabernacle. His world was one of ritual and reverence, of ancient objects and whispered prayers, of shadows and lamplight, and the constant awareness that this place was different from all other places. He opened the doors of the sanctuary each morning, flooding the holy space with light. It was his job to unlock the heavy wooden doors that seal the sacred from the profane, to let in the dawn and with it the worshippers who would come seeking connection with the divine. He assisted Eli in the daily tasks of worship, learning the intricate patterns of sacrifice and ceremony, memorizing which offerings required which procedures, understanding the difference between sin offerings and burnt offerings and peace offerings, learning to read the subtleties of ritual purity. He tended the lamps that burned through the night, ensuring their wicks were trimmed and their oil replenished. This was not glamorous work. It required attention to detail, a willingness to wake in the darkness to check that the flames had not guttered out, an understanding that these small acts of maintenance were what kept the sacred space functioning. The lamps represented the presence of God, and Samuel learned that presence requires constant tending, constant attention, constant care. He cleaned the sacred vessels, swept the courts, washed the linens used in ceremonies, helped prepare the incense, carried water, ran errands. He memorized scriptures, learning to recite the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the tales of Moses and the Exodus, the laws given at Sinai. His education was entirely religious, entirely focused on service, entirely oriented towards something beyond himself. By all accounts, Samuel was a good child, humble, obedient, faithful in small things. The text tells us he grew in favour with both the Lord and with people. He was not resentful of his circumstances. He did not seem to chafe against the boundaries of his unusual childhood. Perhaps he had accepted that this was simply who he was, the boy who belonged to God, the boy who lived in the house of the Lord. But what must it have been like psychologically? To have no mother to comfort you when you woke from nightmares, to have no siblings to quarrel and play with, to grow up watching Eli's corrupt sons come and go, seeing the way they abused their position, hearing the whispers of their misconduct, to be surrounded by holiness and yet witness its corruption, to serve faithfully while those who should have been models of righteousness displayed only greed and lust and contempt for the sacred. Did Samuel wonder why he had been left here? Did he feel abandoned by the mother who had kissed him goodbye and walked away? Did he question whether the God he served even noticed his small acts of service? The text does not tell us. We see only the external facts, a boy growing up, performing his duties, learning his role. But surely there were moments of loneliness, moments of doubt, moments when the weight of it all felt too heavy for small shoulders to carry. Hannah visited when she could. Each year during the family's annual pilgrimage to Shiloh, she would bring Samuel a new robe she'd made for him, watching him grow, trying to compress a year of mothering into a few brief encounters. These visits must have been both blessing and torment. The joy of seeing his mother mingled with the pain of watching her leave again. The new robe, a reminder that somewhere he had a home, a family, a life he was not permitted to live. Yet there is no indication that Samuel rebelled or resented his circumstances. He simply continued, day after day, year after year, faithful in the small things, present in the sacred space, available to be used however God saw fit. There was no indication in those early years that he would become anything more than a helpful assistant to an aging priest, that he would one day be the voice through which God spoke to an entire nation. But God, it seems, has a habit of preparing his instruments in obscurity before bringing them into the light. Samuel was being shaped by his circumstances, formed by his loneliness, refined by his faithfulness in tasks that no one celebrated. He was learning what it meant to serve without applause, to be obedient without immediate reward, to remain present even when presence felt like punishment. He was learning to listen in the silence. Chapter 2. The State of Israel at the Time. To appreciate what happened on that quiet night when God called Samuel's name, you need to understand the spiritual condition of Israel during this period. It was, to put it simply, a disaster. But the disaster raises uncomfortable questions that the text never fully answers. Questions about divine silence. Questions about why systems of worship become corrupt. Questions about what happens when the mediators between heaven and earth become obstacles instead of conduits. The problem started with Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. These two men had inherited their father's position as priests, but they had not inherited his reverence for the sacred. They were corrupt in ways that went beyond simple moral failing. They actively perverted the worship of God, treating the sacrifices and offerings as opportunities for personal gain, turning the sacred into the profane with a systematic cruelty that suggests something darker than mere greed. When people brought animals to sacrifice at Shiloh, the priests were entitled to a specific portion of the meat according to the law of Moses. But Hophni and Phinehas were not content with their allotted share, with what had been designated as rightfully theirs. They wanted more. They wanted the best. They wanted what belonged to God. They would send their servants to threaten worshippers, demanding the choicest cuts of meat before the fat was even burned on the altar, as required by law. The fat belonged to God. That was non-negotiable in the sacrificial system. The burning of the fat was the moment when the sacrifice became truly sacred, when the offering transitioned from human gift to divine acceptance. But Hophni and Phinehas did not care about divine acceptance. They cared about their appetites. If people objected, if they tried to follow the proper procedures and insist that the fat be burned first, the servants would respond with threats of violence. We will take it by force if necessary. The priests were literally stealing from God, taking what belonged to the altar and consuming it themselves. They were turning worship into extortion, using their position of spiritual authority to exploit the vulnerable and the faithful. But their corruption went even darker, into territories that the text only hints at with uncomfortable brevity. They engaged in sexual immorality with women who served at the entrance to the sanctuary. These were women who had dedicated themselves to service at the tabernacle, who came to worship and serve with sincere devotion, and Hophni and Phinehas exploited them, used their authority and position to prey upon those who should have been under their protection. They turned the house of God into a place of exploitation and abuse, where the very people who were supposed to represent divine holiness became perpetrators of trauma. Worship became a source of fear rather than transcendence. People stopped coming, or when they came with cynicism and resentment, going through the motions but empty of faith. How could you trust a system where the gatekeepers were predators? How could you believe in the holiness of a place where the priests defiled it daily? The sanctuary at Shiloh, which was meant to be the central hub of Israel's spiritual life, became instead a monument to religious corruption. Eli knew what his sons were doing. The text makes this painfully clear. People told him. They came with reports of misconduct, of abuse, of exploitation. He heard the rumours and saw the evidence. He was not ignorant. He was not blind to their crimes. And to his credit, he confronted them. But his rebukes were weak, almost apologetic, carrying no weight and no consequence. Why do you do such things? I hear reports from the people about your wicked deeds. If someone sins against another person, God may mediate. But if someone sins against the Lord, who will intercede? The words acknowledge the problem but offer no solution. There is no threat of removal from office, no stripping of authority, no punishment that might actually deter the behaviour. Just words, just disappointment, just a father hoping his wayward sons might suddenly develop a conscience they had never demonstrated. Hophni and Phinehas ignored their father and continued their corruption. Why wouldn't they? There were no consequences. Eli's position as high priest gave him the authority to remove them, to appoint others, to enforce standards. But he did nothing, and his inaction was itself a form of action, a choice that enabled the continued degradation of worship. The impact on Israel's spiritual life was catastrophic. The text records it with devastating simplicity. The people came to despise the offerings to the Lord. Think about what that means. The sacrificial system was the heart of Israel's covenant relationship with God. It was how sins were atoned for, how gratitude was expressed, how the community maintained its connection with the divine. And people were learning to despise it, to see it as corrupt and meaningless, to associate worship with exploitation rather than with holiness. Faith withered. Cynicism spread. A generation was growing up believing that God either did not care about corruption in his own house, or that he was powerless to stop it, or worse, that he did not exist at all, and the whole system was simply a mechanism for priestly power and exploitation. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this era, the detail that haunts the narrative with its implications, was not the corruption of the priests. It was the silence of heaven. The scripture records it with haunting simplicity. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. Think about what that means. In a culture where prophets and priests were meant to be the conduits between God and humanity, the channel had gone quiet. God was not speaking. Or if he was, no one was hearing. Prophecies were scarce to the point of being legendary. Divine visions were so uncommon that when someone claimed to have received one, it was met with skepticism rather than expectation. But why? The text does not explain. It simply records the fact of divine silence as if it were weather, as if the absence of God's voice was as natural and unremarkable as a drought. But this raises uncomfortable questions. Had God withdrawn because of the corruption? Was the silence a form of judgment, a divine turning away from a people who had corrupted worship? Or had the people simply stopped listening? Had they become so cynical and so wounded by a religious hypocrisy that they could no longer hear what was being said? Or was there another possibility, one that the text does not explore but that hangs in the air like smoke? Perhaps the priests, who were supposed to be the mediators between God and people, had become such effective blockers of communication that divine messages simply could not get through. Perhaps Hophni and Phinehas were not just corrupt individuals, but symptoms of a systemic failure, a spiritual infrastructure that had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Israel was spiritually adrift, navigating by dead reckoning through waters where the stars had gone dark. There were no prophets to consult, no clear word from God about how to proceed, no divine guidance about which way to turn, just the daily grind of existence, the hollow rituals performed without meaning, the slow death of a people's faith in the face of institutional betrayal. This was the world into which Samuel was growing up, a world where the representatives of God were corrupt, where worship had become hollow, where heaven seemed distant and disinterested. If you were a young person in that era, what would you believe about the divine? Would you expect God to speak? Would you even know what his voice sounded like? Would you be able to distinguish a divine call from your own imagination or from the voice of a very human priest? Samuel cleaned the lamps each evening, ensuring the light would burn through the night. It was a practical task, a maintenance duty, nothing spiritual about it. He trimmed the wicks, refilled the oil reservoirs, ensured the flames were steady. But in that small act, there was a symbol that perhaps Samuel himself did not fully understand. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Somewhere in the darkness a light still burned, and into that darkness, cutting through the silence that had lasted for generations, a voice was about to break through. Chapter 3. The night God spoke. The night began like any other. Samuel had completed his duties for the day, working through the familiar routines that structured his life. The sanctuary was clean, the floors swept, the vessels washed and arranged in their proper places. The lamps were lit, their flames steady, casting dancing shadows across the ancient stones. The sacred space was prepared for the silence of the evening hours, for the long watch through darkness toward dawn. Eli, now elderly and nearly blind, his eyes grown dim from age and perhaps from seeing too much corruption without acting, had retired to his usual place. He moved slowly now, carefully, feeling his way along walls he had walked beside for decades. His sleeping area was separate but nearby, close enough that Samuel could hear him if he called, out in the night. Samuel lay down in his customary sleeping spot somewhere near the chamber where the Ark of the Covenant rested. The exact location is not specified in the text, but the implication is clear. He slept in proximity to the most sacred object in all of Israel, closer to the physical representation of God's presence than anyone else in the nation that night. The Ark was the most sacred object in Israel, a gold-covered chest containing the tablets of the law, a jar of manna, and Aaron's staff that had budded. But more than its contents, the Ark represented the very presence of God among his people. It was the throne of the invisible king, the place where heaven touched earth, the point of contact between the divine and the mortal. To sleep near it was to sleep in the shadow of holiness, though Samuel likely thought nothing of it. This was simply where he slept, as ordinary to him as any bedroom, as familiar as his own breathing. The lamp of God was still burning, casting flickering shadows across the stone walls. This detail matters more than it might initially seem. In the Jewish tradition, the lamp in the sanctuary, the menorah that burned with consecrated oil, was not allowed to go out until morning light made it unnecessary. It represented the presence of God, the light that persisted even in darkness, the hope that had not yet been extinguished. The phrase, "the lamp of God had not yet gone out," carries within it both promise and warning. Not yet, but it could. The light was still burning, but barely. The presence was still there, but fading. As long as the lamp burned, there was hope. As long as the light persisted against the encroaching darkness, God had not abandoned his dwelling place entirely. Samuel drifted into sleep, a boy exhausted from the honest labour of serving in the house of God. His breathing slowed, his muscles relaxed. He sank into that deep, dreamless sleep that comes from physical work and a clear conscience. The sanctuary around him settled into its nighttime sounds. The creak of cooling stone, the whisper of wind through high windows, the distant cry of a night bird, the soft flutter of the lamp flames, and then, in the darkness, cutting through the silence like a knife through cloth, he heard his name, Samuel. The voice was clear, distinct, personal. Not a shout that would echo through the halls, but not a whisper that could be mistaken for imagination either. It had the quality of someone standing nearby, speaking with intention and purpose, with the certainty that they would be heard. It was a voice that expected a response. Samuel's eyes snapped open. His heart leaped in his chest. There was no confusion, no moment of disorientation. He knew immediately that someone had called him. The voice had been too clear, too deliberate, too unmistakably directed at him. In the darkness, with the lamp casting its uncertain light, Samuel did what made perfect sense to a boy who had grown up serving under an elderly priest. Eli must need something. The old priest was nearly blind now, stumbling in the darkness. Perhaps he had dropped something. Perhaps he needed water. Perhaps he was unwell and required assistance. Samuel threw off whatever covering he used against the night chill and ran to where Eli slept. "Here I am. You called me?" The response was immediate, instinctive. "Here I am." Two words that would become the defining posture of Samuel's entire life. Not, "What do you want?" Not, "Can it wait until morning?" Just presence. Just availability. Here I am. Eli, pulled from sleep and confused, his mind foggy with the remnants of dreams, looked in the direction of Samuel's voice with eyes, that could barely make out shapes in the darkness. "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Samuel returned to his place, perhaps a little puzzled, but not overly concerned. Perhaps he had been dreaming. Perhaps the transition from sleep to waking had jumbled his perceptions. Perhaps the old man had called out in his sleep and forgotten. These things happen. The mind plays tricks in the boundary spaces between consciousness and unconsciousness. He lay back down, pulled his covering around him, and closed his eyes, willing himself back towards sleep. The sanctuary settled back into silence. The lamp continued its steady burning. Outside, the wind moved through the hills with a sound like breathing. Samuel's heartbeat slowed back to its resting rhythm. Samuel? Again. The same voice, the same clarity, the same undeniable sense that someone was speaking directly to him, calling him by name with purpose and intention. This was not imagination. This was not the remnant of a dream clinging to the edge of waking. This was not the echo of Eli's voice misheard in the darkness. Someone had called his name clearly and deliberately, as real as the stone beneath him and the lamplight flickering against the walls. Once more, Samuel got up and went to Eli. His bare feet made soft sounds against the cold stone floor. His breathing was quicker now, his confusion deeper. If Eli had not called the first time, then who had? "Here I am. You called me." Eli, now more awake and perhaps slightly irritated at being disturbed a second time, sent him away again with a tone that suggested both confusion and mild frustration. "I did not call, my son. Go back and lie down." Samuel returned, but now there was a question forming in his mind that would not be silenced. If Eli was not calling him, then who was? Was someone playing a trick? Was there an intruder in the sanctuary hiding in the shadows, calling his name for some unknown purpose? But the voice had not seemed mischievous or threatening. It had been steady, certain, intimate, the kind of voice that knows you, that has the right to call your name. He lay back down, but this time sleep did not come easily. His eyes stayed open, staring into the darkness above him. His ears strained for any sound, any indication of who or what had spoken to him. The lamp flickered. A moth circled near its flame. Time stretched and compressed in that strange way it does when you are lying awake in the dark, unsure whether minutes or hours are passing. Samuel. The third time, Samuel abandoned any doubt or hesitation. Someone was calling him, and if it was not Eli, then perhaps the old priest was confused. Perhaps he was calling out without realizing it. Perhaps his dreams were speaking through him. Samuel got up once more, faster now, urgent, and went to Eli. He stood at the foot of the old priest's sleeping mat, his young face barely visible in the dim light that filtered in from the main chamber. "Here I am. You called me." And finally, after decades of serving in the sanctuary, after years of watching the word of the Lord become rare and vision scarce, after witnessing the corruption of his sons and the slow death of Israel's faith, Eli understood. The realization must have hit him like a physical blow. God was calling the boy, not the high priest, not the experienced religious leader, not the man who had served in this place for decades. The boy who cleaned the floors and tended the lamps and slept near the ark without fully comprehending what that meant. Eli's response is one of the most beautiful moments in the entire narrative. He could have been jealous, wounded by the divine bypassing, bitter that his years of service were being overlooked in favour of a child. He could have been defensive, questioning whether this was really happening, whether Samuel was perhaps confused or making things up. He could have claimed the voice for himself, insisted that any divine communication should come through proper channels, through the established hierarchy of priesthood. But instead, Eli became a teacher in the truest sense. He gave Samuel the gift of understanding and the words that would change everything. He put aside whatever personal feelings he might have had, and focused entirely on helping Samuel navigate what was about to happen. "Go and lie down," Eli said, and you can hear in those words both resignation and hope, both the sadness of being passed over and the wonder that God was speaking again at all. And if he calls you, say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Those words, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Not who are you, not what you want, not prove yourself to me. Just openness, just availability, just the humble acknowledgement that if God is speaking, the only appropriate response is to listen. Samuel returned to his place one more time. He lay down in the darkness, the lamp of God still burning nearby, casting its uncertain light across ancient stones, and he waited. His heart must have been pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His mind must have been racing with questions and fears and wonder. What does the voice of God sound like? What will he say? Am I worthy to hear it? What if I do not understand? What if I get it wrong? The silence stretched. The lamp flickered. Outside, the night continued its slow progression toward dawn. And then, for the fourth time, the voice came. But this time there was a difference. This time the name was repeated, spoken twice, with an intimacy and urgency that had not been there before. Samuel! Samuel! The repetition is significant. In Hebrew, when a name is called twice, it indicates intimacy, urgency, importance. Abraham, Abraham, Moses, Moses. Now Samuel, Samuel. This was not a casual summons. This was personal, direct, unmistakable. This time, the boy was ready. Following Eli's instructions exactly, word for word, he responded with the words that have echoed through millennia as the perfect posture of faith, the ideal response to divine initiative. Speak, for your servant is listening. And God spoke. What happened next was not what a child would want to hear. God did not give Samuel a message of encouragement or blessing. He did not reveal some beautiful mystery or share some cosmic secret about the nature of reality or the structure of heaven. He did not offer comfort or promise Samuel a glorious future. Instead, God gave Samuel a prophecy of judgment, and the judgment was against Eli's household, against the man who had been like a father to him, against the only family he had truly known. God told Samuel that he was about to do something in Israel that would make the ears of everyone who heard it tingle. That phrase, ears tingling, suggests something shocking, something that would reverberate through the nation like a physical sensation. This was not going to be a quiet judgment, a private correction. This was going to be public, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. He was going to carry out against Eli everything he had spoken concerning his family, from beginning to end. There had been warnings before. A prophet had come to Eli years earlier with a similar message, speaking of judgment to come, of the priesthood being taken from his lineage, of his sons dying on the same day. That prophecy had been spoken and then seemingly forgotten, filed away as one of those uncomfortable truths that people acknowledge but never really expect to see fulfilled. But God was saying now that the time of fulfillment had come. The warnings were over. The judgment was at hand. The reason was clear and devastating. Eli knew about the sins of his sons. He knew they were blaspheming God, treating the sacred as profane, exploiting women, stealing from the altar, corrupting worship itself. He had heard the reports. He had seen the evidence. He had confronted them, yes, but his rebukes were empty, carrying no weight, leading to no consequences. He had failed to restrain them, failed to use his authority to stop them, failed to choose God's honour over his son's comfort, and that failure, that complicity through inaction, meant that the guilt of Eli's house would never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering. Think about what that means. In a religious system built entirely around sacrifice and atonement, where every sin could theoretically be covered by the blood of animals and the proper rituals, God was declaring that some corruption runs too deep for ritual to reach. Some betrayals are so fundamental that the system itself cannot address them. Eli's family would carry their guilt to the grave and beyond, marked forever by their choice to prioritize family loyalty over divine justice. Imagine being Samuel in that moment. You are a child, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, lying in the darkness of a sanctuary, having just heard the voice of God for the first time in your life. And the message you have been given is not one of blessing or calling or future glory. It is a message of doom for the man who has raised you, who has taught you everything you know about worship and service, who has been your only father figure in a life marked by abandonment and loneliness. The weight of it must have been crushing. How do you speak words of judgment to someone you love? How do you become the bearer of bad news that will break someone's heart? How do you look into the eyes of a man who has shown you kindness and tell him that his family line is cursed, that his sons will die, that everything he has built will crumble? This was the cost of prophecy that no one talks about. This was the burden of truth that cannot be softened or avoided or delayed. Samuel had been given a message, and whether he wanted to deliver it or not was irrelevant. The truth had been spoken to him, and now he was responsible for speaking it to others. This is what it means to be a prophet. Not visions and mystical experiences and spiritual heights, but the grinding, awful responsibility of speaking truths that wound you as deeply as they wound those who hear them. The rest of the night must have been agony for Samuel. The text tells us he lay there until dawn, too afraid to tell Eli what he'd heard. He did not sleep. How could he? His mind must have raced through possibilities. Maybe he had misunderstood. Maybe there was a way to soften the message to make it less harsh. Maybe if he just kept quiet, the whole thing would fade like a dream, and he could go back to his simple life of tending lamps and sweeping floors. But deep down, he knew. The voice had been too clear. The message had been too specific. And God had not asked his opinion about whether this was a good idea or whether Samuel felt ready for such responsibility. The divine does not consult us about our readiness. It simply calls, and we must answer. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Message. As morning light began to filter into the sanctuary, pale and hesitant through the high windows, Samuel rose and went about his duties as usual. Muscle memory guided him through the familiar routines. He opened the doors of the house of the Lord, pushing aside the heavy wooden barriers that sealed the sacred from the profane, letting in the day, with all its ordinary demands. But everything felt different now. The air was heavier, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical weight. The silence was louder, filled with the words he carried but could not speak. He carried within him words that would change everything, and he was terrified to voice them. His hands shook as he performed his tasks. He fumbled with the lamp wicks, nearly spilling oil on the floor. He could not meet anyone's eyes. Every sound made him jump, expecting Eli to call for him, to demand the message, to force him to speak the unspeakable. Eli, however, knew something had happened. Years of serving in the sanctuary had given him an intuition about spiritual matters that his failing eyesight could not diminish. He could sense the change in Samuel, could feel the weight the boy was carrying. He called Samuel to him, his voice gentle but insistent, and when the boy came, reluctant and pale, the old priest asked him directly, "Samuel, my son, what was it he said to you? Please do not hide it from me." Then he added words that carried the weight of both authority and desperation. "May God deal with you, be it ever so severely if you hide from me anything he told you." It was an oath, a binding formula that made concealment impossible. Eli was not giving Samuel an easy out. He was demanding truth, however painful, however devastating. And in doing so, he was teaching Samuel one of the most important lessons of prophetic ministry. That truth matters more than comfort, that integrity requires speaking even when silence would be kinder. There is something deeply moving about this moment. Eli was giving Samuel permission to speak truth, even painful truth. He was not demanding a comfortable answer. He was not pressuring the boy to lie or soften the message. He was not using his position as high priest to intimidate or manipulate. He was simply asking for honesty, for the faithful delivery of whatever word had been given, regardless of personal cost. Samuel, to his credit, did not hold back. He told Eli everything, every word of the judgment, every detail of the coming consequences, every aspect of the doom pronounced against his house. He did not sugarcoat it. He did not try to make it easier to hear. He did not add comforting caveats or suggest ways the judgment might be avoided. He simply delivered the message as it had been given to him, faithful to both God and to Eli in his refusal to distort the truth. The words must have felt like stones in his mouth. each one heavy and sharp. He would have watched Eli's face as he spoke, looking for signs of anger or rejection or denial. But what he saw instead was something he had not expected. Eli's response is remarkable in its humility and resignation. He did not rage against the pronouncement. He did not question Samuel's experience or suggest the boy had misunderstood or imagined things. He did not blame Samuel for being the messenger or accuse him of disloyalty or ingratitude. He simply said, with a weariness that spoke of years of knowing this moment would come, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." There is defeat in those words, yes, but there is also acceptance. A kind of peace that comes from finally having the truth spoken aloud, from no longer living in the shadow of unacknowledged reality. Eli had known for years that his sons were corrupt. He had known that his failure to stop them was a kind of complicity, a betrayal of his calling and his God. The judgment was not a surprise. It was an inevitability finally spoken aloud, a truth that had been hovering unspoken in the air for years finally given voice and substance. And perhaps in some way, Eli was relieved that the silence had been broken, even if the words spoken were words of judgment. Perhaps there is a relief that comes from knowing, from having certainty, even when that certainty is terrible. Perhaps after years of wondering when the hammer would fall, there was a strange comfort in finally hearing it fall, in knowing the shape of the future even when that future was dark. What Samuel learned that night and that morning was something most of us spend a lifetime avoiding. That truth is not always comfortable, that faithfulness sometimes means delivering hard words, and that love does not require us to hide reality from those we care about. Samuel could have lied to Eli. He could have softened the message or claimed he did not remember the details, or suggested that perhaps he had misunderstood what God was saying, but he chose honesty, and in doing so he established the pattern that would define his entire ministry. He would be a prophet who spoke the word of the Lord without compromise, without concern for how it would be received, without fear of the consequences. Not because he was harsh or unfeeling, but because he understood that truth, however painful, is ultimately an act of respect. To lie to someone, even to spare their feelings, is to treat them as less than fully human, as incapable of bearing reality. Samuel gave Eli the dignity of truth, and Eli received it with the dignity of acceptance. Chapter 5. Samuel becomes a prophet. After that night, everything changed for Samuel. The text tells us that he grew, and the Lord was with him, letting none of his words fall to the ground. That phrase, letting none of his words fall to the ground, is the ancient way of saying that everything Samuel prophesied came true. He was not speaking his own opinions or making educated guesses or offering the kind of vague predictions that could be interpreted multiple ways, depending on how events unfolded. He was speaking with divine authority, and reality itself confirmed his words with uncomfortable precision. The prophecy about Eli's house came true exactly as Samuel had spoken it. The details are grim and worth recounting because they establish Samuel's credibility as a true prophet in a time when false prophets were common and people had grown cynical about divine communication. Israel went to war against the Philistines, their perennial enemy. In the first battle, the Israelites were defeated and thousands of soldiers died. In desperation, the elders decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh to the battlefield, believing that God's physical presence would guarantee victory. Hophni and Phinehas accompanied the Ark, treating it like a magical talisman rather than the throne of the living God. The Israelites shouted when the Ark arrived, a roar so loud that the ground shook. The Philistines were terrified at first, knowing the stories of what the God of Israel had done to Egypt. But they fought anyway, and in the battle that followed, Israel was utterly defeated. 30,000 soldiers died, and on that same day, exactly as prophesied, both Hophni and Phinehas were killed. The Ark of God was captured by the Philistines, carried off as a trophy of war. When a messenger brought the news to Shiloh, Eli was sitting by the road, his heart trembling for the Ark of God. When he heard that the Ark had been captured and his sons were dead, the 98-year-old priest fell backward off his chair, broke his neck, and died. The priesthood of his line ended in that moment, cut off exactly as God had declared. It was a devastating fulfillment, but it established beyond doubt that Samuel spoke with divine authority. He had predicted these events when he was just a child, and they had come to pass exactly as he said. The word of the Lord through Samuel was reliable, trustworthy, deserving of attention. As Samuel matured from boy to young man, his reputation spread throughout Israel like wildfire. From Dan in the far north to Beersheba in the deep south, spanning the entire geographical extent of Israel's territory, everyone knew that Samuel had been established as a prophet of the Lord. The word that had been rare, the visions that had been scarce, now flowed through this young man who had learned to listen in the darkness. But Samuel was more than just a prophet delivering occasional messages. God continued to appear at Shiloh, revealing himself to Samuel through his word on a regular basis. Samuel became the primary channel of divine communication for the entire nation. The silence had been broken. The channel between heaven and earth, clogged by corruption and complacency for generations, had been cleared. And the instrument God chose was not a powerful warrior, or a cunning politician, or even an experienced priest with decades of religious training. It was a boy who had learned to say 5 simple words: "Speak, for your servant is listening." Samuel's influence on Israel cannot be overstated. He became the bridge between the chaotic era of the judges and the establishment of the monarchy, standing at one of the most critical transitions in the nation's history. He was the last judge, travelling on a circuit through Bethel, Gilgal and Mizpah, settling disputes and administering justice with a wisdom that people recognised as coming from God. He was also the first of the great prophets, the founder of a prophetic tradition that would produce Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all the voices that would call Israel back to God throughout its history. When the people demanded a king like the surrounding nations, it was Samuel who anointed Saul, a tall and handsome man from the tribe of Benjamin, as Israel's first king. And when Saul proved disobedient and unfaithful to God, it was Samuel who had to deliver yet another hard message of judgment, who had to watch another man he had elevated fall under divine displeasure. Later, it was Samuel who anointed David, the youngest son of Jesse, a shepherd boy with no apparent qualifications except that God had chosen him. That shepherd boy would become Israel's greatest king, the man whose lineage would eventually produce the Messiah. But beyond the political role, beyond the anointing of kings and the settling of disputes, Samuel represented something Israel desperately needed: spiritual integrity in a world corroded by compromise. In a time when the priesthood had become corrupt, when worship had become hollow, when the word of the Lord was rare, Samuel embodied what it meant to hear from God and speak his truth faithfully regardless of personal cost. He reformed religious life throughout Israel, establishing schools of prophets where young men could learn to listen for God's voice and speak his word. He called the people back to authentic worship, challenging them to put away their foreign gods and serve the Lord only. He led the nation in repentance at Mizpah, where they fasted and confessed their sins, acknowledging that they had abandoned God. And when the Philistines attacked during that gathering, Samuel interceded for the people, and God threw the enemy into confusion with thunder and lightning, giving Israel a decisive victory. Samuel demonstrated that God had not abandoned his people, that the silence had been circumstantial rather than permanent, that divine presence and power were still available to those who would seek them with integrity. The boy who once cleaned floors and trimmed lamp wicks became the conscience of a nation. The child who slept near the ark became the voice through which God spoke to kings and commoners alike. His authority came not from position, or political power, or military might, but from the simple fact that he had learned to listen and had the courage to speak what he heard, even when speaking cost him dearly. Chapter 6. The Legacy of the Story. So what do we take from this ancient narrative? What does it mean for us, centuries removed from oil lamps and tabernacles and sleeping near the Ark of the Covenant? And perhaps more intriguingly, what questions does this story raise that it never fully answers? First, there is the theme of listening. God can speak in quiet places, in ordinary moments, when we least expect it. Samuel was not performing some elaborate spiritual ritual when God called his name. He was not fasting on a mountain. He was not in a trance or a vision quest. He was sleeping, exhausted from a day of mundane labour. He was simply present in a sacred space, available to be awakened. How often do we miss the voice of the divine because we are too busy, too distracted, too convinced that revelation only comes in spectacular packages? We wait for burning bushes and angelic visitations, for dramatic signs and unmistakable interventions, while the still small voice speaks in the darkness and we mistake it for our imagination, or for human conversation, or for nothing at all. Samuel teaches us that sometimes the most profound moments arrive softly, in the space between waking and sleeping, in the darkness when our defences are down and our minds are quiet enough to hear what has always been speaking. But this raises uncomfortable questions. How many times has that voice spoken and we have ignored it? How many times have we attributed divine communication to coincidence or psychology or wish fulfillment because we have lost the ability to recognise it for what it is? Second, there is the theme of obedience. Samuel's first response when he heard his name was immediate and complete. Here I am. No hesitation, no calculation, no weighing of options or considering whether this was a good time, just presence and availability. Not, what do you want, but here I am. Not, let me think about it, but immediate response. Later, when Eli gave him the words to use, Samuel followed the instruction exactly. He did not improvise or try to improve on the formula or insert his own personality into the exchange. He simply said what he had been taught to say: "Speak, for your servant is listening." Obedience in this story is not about blind submission to authority. It is about being teachable, about recognizing when someone knows more than you do, about trusting guidance even when you do not fully understand where it is leading. But there is something deeper here, something that troubles the waters of easy interpretation. Samuel was obedient to a voice he had never heard before, to a presence he could not see, based entirely on the instruction of a priest whose own family was corrupt, and whose judgment had been compromised by his failure to discipline his sons. What made Samuel so certain that this was God speaking, and not some other voice? What internal compass guided him toward trust, when skepticism would have been equally reasonable? Third, there is the theme of humility. Samuel's greatness began in small acts of service. He was faithful in opening doors, in cleaning, in tending lamps, in all the unglamorous work that keeps a sacred space functioning. He did not despise the small things, or consider himself above menial tasks. He swept floors with the same attention he later brought to anointing kings. He trimmed lamp wicks with the same care he would later exercise in delivering prophetic words, and it was in that posture of humble service, in the daily repetition of small faithful acts, that God found him. How different this is from our modern obsession with platform and visibility, with making a name for ourselves and ensuring everyone knows our accomplishments, with treating service as a stepping stone to something better rather than as its own reward. Samuel reminds us that true influence is built in obscurity, that character is formed in the small decisions no one sees, that greatness is the fruit of faithfulness in little things rather than the result of ambitious self-promotion. But again, there is a mystery here. Why Samuel? What was it about this particular boy that made him suitable for this calling? The text gives no indication that he was exceptional in any way. He was simply there, simply faithful, simply available. Which raises the question, are there others who are equally faithful, equally available, who never heard their name called? Is divine calling arbitrary, or is there some hidden criteria that determines who hears the voice and who does not? Fourth, there is the theme of responsibility. Sometimes truth is hard but necessary. Samuel's first message from God was a message of judgment, and he had to deliver it to someone he loved. This is the cost of being a conduit for truth. You do not get to choose which messages are convenient and which are difficult. You do not get to edit reality to make it more palatable. You do not get to withhold hard truths, because speaking them might damage relationships or cost you social capital. If you are going to be a voice for something beyond yourself, whether you call that voice God or conscience or truth, or simply what is, you have to be willing to speak even when the words cut you as deeply as they cut those who hear them. Samuel could have spared Eli. He could have lied or softened the message or claimed he did not remember the details. But he chose the harder path of honesty, and in doing so he honoured both Eli and himself. Yet this raises ethical questions that the narrative does not resolve. What is the balance between truth and compassion? When does speaking hard truths become cruelty disguised as honesty? Samuel was a child delivering a message he did not create and could not change. But what about us? When the truths we must speak are filtered through our own perceptions and biases and limited understanding, how do we know when to speak and when to remain silent? Fifth, there is the theme of hope. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Even in the darkest period of Israel's spiritual life, when the priesthood was corrupt and the word of the Lord was rare and the nation was spiritually adrift, there was still a light burning somewhere in the darkness. God had not abandoned his people. He was simply waiting for someone who would listen, someone who would respond, someone who would be faithful with what was given to them. Samuel represents the truth that it is never too late for renewal, that no matter how far things have fallen, no matter how corrupt the systems or how cynical the people, there is always the possibility of a voice in the darkness calling us back to what matters. The light may be flickering, the wick may be nearly consumed, the oil may be running low. But as long as there is any light at all, there is hope for rekindling, for replenishment, for the dawn that follows even the longest night. But this optimistic reading sits uncomfortably with the historical reality. The lamp did eventually go out. The sanctuary at Shiloh was destroyed. The ark was captured and never returned to that place. The line of Eli ended in blood and disgrace. Samuel's calling did not prevent disaster. It only narrated it before it happened. So what kind of hope is this? Is it simply the hope that truth will be spoken, even if it changes nothing? Is it the hope that someone will bear witness, even in the midst of collapse? Finally, there is something unspoken in this narrative that deserves attention. God bypassed the entire religious hierarchy to speak to a child. He did not go through official channels. He did not honour the established order. He did not consult with the high priest or seek permission from religious authorities. He simply called out in the darkness to a boy who had no status, no authority, no credentials beyond faithfulness in small things. This is either deeply encouraging or deeply unsettling, depending on your perspective. It suggests that divine communication is not controlled by institutions, that truth can emerge from the margins, that the voice of God might speak to those we least expect, rather than to those we have designated as official intermediaries. But it also raises anarchistic questions about authority and order, about how we distinguish genuine divine calling from delusion or manipulation, about what happens when everyone claims to hear the voice of God speaking contradictory messages. Samuel's story is ultimately about availability. He was not the most powerful person in Israel. He was not the most educated or the most connected. He was simply present, attentive, and willing to respond when he heard his name called. And that was enough. That has always been enough. But it invites us to ask, what are we available for? What sacred spaces do we inhabit, whether physical or spiritual or psychological, where we might be found by whatever calls to us in the darkness? And when that call comes, will we recognize it, or will we mistake it for something ordinary, something explainable, something that requires no response? Epilogue, the voice in the night. Close your eyes and imagine that sanctuary again. The vast stone building in Shiloh, the oil lamps casting their gentle light, the shadows dancing on walls that have witnessed generations of worship and neglect. Imagine the boy lying near the ark, exhausted from a day of simple service, drifting into sleep with no expectation that this night will be different from any other. And then the voice, clear, personal, undeniable, a voice that breaks through the silence of heaven and calls a child by name. Samuel's story is a reminder that the divine does not always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it comes as a whisper in the darkness. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a question repeated until we finally understand that we are being addressed. Sometimes the most significant moments of our lives happen when we are alone, unguarded, simply present in a space where we have made ourselves available to something greater than ourselves. The lamp of God is still burning. That is the promise embedded in this ancient narrative. No matter how dark the times, no matter how corrupt the systems, no matter how silent heaven seems, there is always a light somewhere refusing to go out, and there is always the possibility that in the quiet, in the stillness, in the spaces between our busy thoughts and desperate prayers, we might hear our name spoken by a voice we do not yet recognize. The question is not whether the voice is calling. The question is whether we are listening. Samuel lay in that sanctuary as a boy and became a prophet because he learned to say 5 words that changed everything. Speak, for your servant is listening. He did not demand proof. He did not negotiate terms. He did not insist on understanding everything before committing to anything. He simply made himself available, and availability was enough. Perhaps that is the real legacy of Samuel's calling. Not that he became powerful or influential or historically significant, though he became all those things. The real legacy is that he teaches us what it looks like to be genuinely open to transformation, to be willing to hear hard truths, to be faithful in small things while waiting for larger purposes to reveal themselves. In our age of constant noise and perpetual distraction, where silence is something to be feared rather than cherished, Samuel's story feels almost subversive. It suggests that the most important communications might not come through our devices or our carefully curated information streams. They might come in the quiet, in the dark, in the moments when we stop performing and simply exist in the presence of something that knows our name. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, consider the possibility that you, too, might be lying in a sacred space, even if you do not recognize it as such. Consider the possibility that there might be a voice, gentle and persistent, calling your name in the darkness. Consider the possibility that the most profound transformation of your life might not begin with a grand revelation or a spectacular sign, but with the simple decision to respond to that voice with 5 words. Speak, for your servant is listening. The lamp is still burning. The voice is still calling. The only question is whether we have ears to hear. There is a place in the ancient world where the wind carries the scent of cedar and jasmine through corridors of polished stone, where lamplight bends against gold-threaded curtains, and the footsteps of servants echo through halls wide enough to swallow the memory of entire nations. This is the Persian Empire at the height of its power, and it stretches from the warm shores of the Aegean Sea to the sun-baked plateaus of India, encompassing 127 provinces and millions of souls who wake each morning beneath the long shadow of a single throne. The empire is not merely large, it is a world unto itself, a civilization built on ceremony and hierarchy, on the careful arrangement of power and the quiet terror of those who live beneath it. At the centre of this vast machine of governance and military might sit a king named Xerxes, known in the ancient Hebrew texts as Ahasuerus, a man whose word is law and whose moods shape the fortunes of empires. He is not a gentle king. He is not a philosopher king who sits in quiet reflection considering the weight of his decisions. He is a king who feasts, who commands, who expects obedience the way the mountains expect silence. And in the 3rd year of his reign, in the royal city of Susa, he throws a party. It is not a party in any sense that the modern world would recognise as modest. This is a celebration that lasts 180 days, a feast that stretches across half a year, during which the king displays the wealth of his kingdom and the glory of his greatness to every prince and official and military commander in his domain. The palace gardens are transformed into something almost dreamlike, hung with white and violet linen curtains fastened to silver rods with cords of fine linen and purple. The couches are gold and silver, set upon a mosaic floor of porphyry and marble and mother of pearl. Wine flows from golden vessels, each one different from the last, and the royal wine is abundant because the king has commanded it. It is excess-made architecture. It is power made edible. And for 6 months, the great men of Persia eat and drink in the shadow of the king's magnificence, and they understand, without being told, what it means to live beneath such authority. When the great feast ends, the king throws another, smaller celebration for all the people in the citadel of Susa, from the greatest to the least. 7 days of additional feasting because the first 180 apparently did not suffice. And on the 7th day of this second celebration, when the king's heart is merry with wine, a thought occurs to him. He wants to show off his wife. Queen Vashti is by all accounts a woman of extraordinary beauty, and the king, flushed with wine and pride and the accumulated pleasure of months of being celebrated, sends his 7 chamberlains to bring her before the assembled guests wearing her royal crown. He wants them to see her. He wants the princes and the nobles to understand that even his queen, the most beautiful woman in the empire, belongs to the tableau of his greatness. She is, in his mind in this moment, another treasure to be displayed alongside the golden vessels and the marble floors and the violet curtains. Vashti refuses. It is one of the most startling moments in all of ancient literature, this quiet, firm refusal from a woman who has every reason in the world to simply comply. We're not given her reasons. The text does not explain her thinking or record her words. It simply tells us that she refused, and this refusal lands in the king's court like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of consequence outward in every direction. The king is furious. His rage burns within him, and he turns to his wise men, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who have access to the king and rank highest in the kingdom, and he asks them what the law demands should be done to Queen Vashti for failing to obey the king's command. The wise men, being wise in the particular way of men who wish to preserve their own power, recognize immediately that this is not simply a domestic dispute. This is a political crisis. If word spreads throughout the empire that Queen Vashti refused the king's command and suffered no consequence, they argue, then every wife in the empire will feel emboldened to show contempt for her husband. The nobles of Persia and Media will hear of what the queen has done, and there will be contempt and anger enough to fill 100 provinces. The solution, they say, is clear. Let a royal decree go out from the king, written in the laws of Persia and Media so that it cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Xerxes, and let the king give her royal position to someone better than she. When this decree is proclaimed throughout the vast empire, all women will honour their husbands, from the greatest to the least. And so it is written. And so it is sealed. And so Queen Vashti, who refused to be displayed like a piece of furniture, disappears from the story, removed from her position by the fear of powerful men who worried what her example might inspire in others. She walks out of the historical record with her dignity intact and her crown surrendered, and the empire turns its attention to finding her replacement. The king's attendants, once his anger has subsided and he has had time to sit with the strangeness of what has happened, suggest a course of action. Let beautiful young virgins be sought throughout the provinces of the empire. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province to gather all beautiful young women to the harem in Susa, to the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch who is in charge of the women. Let them receive beauty treatments for 12 months, and then let the young woman who pleases the king be made queen in Vashti's place. The king agrees. The decree goes out, and from every corner of that vast empire, young women begin the long journey to the palace in Susa. Among them, arriving without fanfare, without political connections, without any of the advantages that the daughters of nobles and merchants might carry with them, is a young Jewish woman named Esther. Her Hebrew name is Hadassah, which means myrtle, but she is known as Esther, a name that may derive from a Persian word meaning star, or perhaps from the name of the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. She is an orphan, her mother and father both dead, and she has been raised by her cousin Mordecai, a man of the tribe of Benjamin whose family was among those carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. Mordecai works at the king's gate, one of the countless officials who fill the lower ranks of the imperial bureaucracy, and he has raised Esther as his own daughter with a care and attentiveness that speaks of genuine love. When the king's decree goes out, Esther is gathered with the other young women and brought to the palace, and before she enters those gates, Mordecai gives her a single instruction: quiet and grave. She is not to reveal her people or her kindred. She is not to tell anyone that she is Jewish. This is not, in the context of the Persian Empire, a strange request. The Jews are a minority population living in exile, their temple destroyed, their city of Jerusalem a ruin, their national identity something they carry internally rather than display publicly. For Esther to identify herself as Jewish would be to invite a different kind of scrutiny, a different kind of treatment, and so she keeps the secret. She enters the palace as simply a beautiful young woman, one among many, carrying her true identity inside herself like a lamp kept lit beneath a covering. What happens next is remarkable in its understated quality. Esther enters the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch in charge of the women, and she finds favour in his sight. He is pleased with her. He quickly provides her with beauty treatments and food and 7 chosen young women to attend her, and he moves her and her attendants to the best place in the harem. There is something happening here beneath the surface of the text, something that the careful reader notices. It is not merely that Esther is beautiful, though she clearly is. It is that she is somehow exactly the right kind of person for whatever space she enters. She finds favour everywhere she goes. The word favour appears again and again in connection with Esther, and it carries the weight of something more than mere personal charm. It carries the sense that doors are opening for her that might remain closed for others, that there is some hand other than coincidence guiding these small moments of goodwill. Mordecai, for his part, does not disappear. Every single day he walks in front of the court of the harem, learning how Esther is and how she fares. He's not a man who releases what he loves carelessly. He keeps vigil from whatever distance is permitted to him, faithful and watchful, while inside the palace walls his cousin learns the customs of the court and undergoes the year-long beauty treatments required of every young woman before she can appear before the king. The process is elaborate and lengthy, a full 12 months of preparation, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. Each young woman comes to the king in the evening and returns in the morning to the second harem, in the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch in charge of the concubines, and she does not come to the king again unless the king delights in her and she is called by name. For most of these young women, this single night determines their entire future. Those who do not please the king well enough to be chosen as queen are simply absorbed into the secondary harem, living out their days in a kind of comfortable captivity, neither wives nor free women, belonging to the palace and to no other life. When Esther's turn comes, she asks for nothing beyond what Haggai the eunuch advises. She does not pile herself with jewellery and perfume and elaborate costuming the way some of the others might. She trusts the judgment of the man who has watched the king's preferences over years of service, who knows better than anyone what quality of simplicity or what kind of presence will resonate in that throne room. And when she comes before the king loves her more than all the women, and she wins grace and favour in his sight more than all the virgins. He places the royal crown on her head and makes her queen instead of Vashti. The king holds a great feast in Esther's honour, giving grants to the provinces and giving gifts with royal generosity. Esther is queen. She lives in the palace with all its beauty and danger and political complexity, carrying her secret Jewish identity inside her, the way you carry a flame against the wind, both concealing it and guarding it. And Mordecai continues to sit at the king's gate, keeping his vigil, watching the story unfold. It is while he is sitting there at the gate that Mordecai overhears something important. Two of the king's officials, Bigthan and Teresh, who guarded the threshold of the palace, have grown angry with the king and are planning to assassinate him. Mordecai learns of this plot and tells Queen Esther, and Esther tells the king in Mordecai's name. The matter is investigated, found to be true, and the two men are hanged on the gallows. And then this detail, this act of loyalty and service that saved the king's life, is recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. It is recorded, written down, filed away, and then apparently nothing happens. Mordecai receives no reward, no promotion, no recognition. The king does not call him forward and give him land or gold or an elevated position. The account is simply noted, and life at the palace continues. This is where the story, which has so far been a tale of court politics and personal fortune, begins to turn towards something darker. After these things, the text says, King Xerxes promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. Haman becomes the second most powerful man in the empire, elevated above all other nobles and servants of the king, and the king commands that all the royal officials at the king's gate are to bow down and pay homage to Haman. This is not merely a matter of professional courtesy. This is a formal act of submission, a public acknowledgement of Haman's power and authority, required by royal decree. Mordecai will not bow. Day after day, the other officials at the king's gate bow when Haman passes. Day after day, Mordecai remains standing. The officials begin to notice. They ask him why he transgresses the king's command. He does not give them a full explanation, but he tells them that he is a Jew. Whether his refusal is rooted in religious conviction, in the ancient enmity between the tribe of Benjamin and the Agagites, in personal pride, or in some combination of these things, the text does not entirely clarify. What is clear is that he will not bow, and the officials tell Haman to see whether Mordecai's words will stand, for he has told them that he is a Jew. When Haman sees for himself that Mordecai does not bow down or pay homage to him, he is filled with fury. But he has also been told that Mordecai is a Jew, and this information, combined with his rage, produces something monstrous in his thinking. It is not enough for him to destroy Mordecai alone, the text says. He has been told what people Mordecai belongs to, and he disdains to lay hands on Mordecai alone. He decides to destroy all the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes, all the people of Mordecai's kind. His personal wounded pride metastasizes into something genocidal. To determine the perfect date for this destruction, Haman casts lots, the ancient method of divination that gives the book its name. The word for lots in Hebrew is Purim, and in the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, Haman casts pur after pur to determine the most favourable date for his plan. The lot falls on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Haman has nearly a year to wait and a year to plan. He goes to the king with a carefully constructed argument. There is a certain people, he says, scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of the kingdom, whose laws are different from those of every other people, and who do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not appropriate for the king to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and Haman will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, to be brought into the king's treasuries. The king, seemingly unbothered by the specifics of who these people are or what they have actually done, removes his signet ring from his hand and gives it to Haman. The money, he says, is given to you, and the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. The decree is written by Haman's scribes in the name of King Xerxes, and sealed with the king's signet ring. It is sent to all the king's satraps and governors and officials of every province, to every people in their own language. The letters command that all Jews, young and old, women and children, be destroyed, killed, and annihilated in a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and their possessions be plundered. Couriers go out swiftly by order of the king, and the decree is issued in Susa the citadel. And then, in one of the most chilling details in all of ancient literature, the text simply notes that the king and Haman sat down to drink, while the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Two men sit with their wine while an empire processes the information that an entire people has been scheduled for extermination. The contrast is almost too stark to bear. While Haman and the king drink, Jewish communities throughout 127 provinces are reading the decree, understanding what it means, beginning to mourn. And in Susa itself, Mordecai tears his clothes and puts on sackcloth and ashes, and goes out into the middle of the city, wailing with a loud and bitter cry. Throughout all the provinces where the king's command and his decree reach, there is great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lie in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs come and tell her what is happening, she is deeply distressed. She sends garments to Mordecai to clothe him, to replace the sackcloth, but Mordecai does not accept them. She sends one of the king's eunuchs, Hathach, to learn what is happening and why. And Mordecai tells Hathach everything that has happened, and gives him a copy of the text of the decree that was issued in Susa for the Jews' destruction, so that Hathach can show it to Esther and explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king and beg his favour and plead with him on behalf of her people. When Esther receives this message, her response is honest and frightened and deeply human. She sends Hathach back to Mordecai with her answer. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, so that he may live. And she has not been called to come into the king for 30 days. This is the reality of her life. She is the queen of the most powerful empire in the known world, and she cannot simply walk into the throne room and speak to her husband. The protocol is absolute. To approach the king uninvited is to risk death. The golden scepter extended toward you is mercy. The golden scepter withheld is execution. And Esther has not been summoned for a month. She does not know if the king is pleased with her. She does not know how she stands in his favour. She is explaining to Mordecai and perhaps also to herself why what he is asking is extraordinarily dangerous. Mordecai's response, delivered through Hathach back to Esther, is one of the most memorable passages in all of Scripture. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? This is not simply a challenge. It is a theological statement and a practical argument simultaneously. Mordecai is telling Esther that her position does not protect her. If she thinks that being queen means she will be exempted from the coming destruction, she is wrong. The decree names all Jews without exception. And then he makes the deeper point. the one that has echoed through centuries of commentary and reflection. Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? All of it, he is suggesting. The death of her parents, the exile of her people, her remarkable beauty, the strange chain of events that led a Jewish orphan girl to become the Queen of Persia, the favour she found with Hegai, the love she inspired in the king, all of it may have been moving toward this single moment. The timing is not accidental. The positioning is not coincidence. And if she does not act, she will lose everything anyway, but the door of opportunity will have closed without her having walked through it. Esther takes this in, and then she sends her answer back to Mordecai, and the person who answers is different from the one who first received his message. She's no longer explaining why she cannot. She's organising how she will. Go, she says, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. The phrase lands with the quiet force of a door closing and another opening. If I perish, I perish. It is not bravado. It is not the theatrical courage of someone who believes they will certainly survive. It is the acknowledgement that the outcome is genuinely uncertain, and the decision to act anyway. She has counted the cost, considered the danger, weighed her position against the lives of her people, and she has chosen. Mordecai goes away and does everything that Esther has commanded him. For 3 days the Jewish community in Susa fasts. Esther and her attendants fast in the palace. There is no food, no water, no ordinary rhythm of daily life. There is only the directed intensity of people who believe that prayer and fasting can reach beyond the walls of a palace, beyond the protocols of an empire, into whatever realm of power and purpose stands above and behind the visible world. They are asking for something they cannot arrange themselves. They are preparing for a confrontation with earthly power by seeking connection with something higher. On the 3rd day, Esther puts on her royal robes. This is not the act of someone who has given up on beauty or protocol. This is a deliberate choice, an understanding that she must appear before the king not as a petitioner in mourning clothes, but as a queen, as someone who belongs in that space. She dresses herself in everything she is, and she walks to the inner court of the king's palace, opposite the king's hall. The king is sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. When the king sees Queen Esther standing in the court, she wins favour in his sight. He holds out to her the golden sceptre that is in his hand. Esther approaches and touches the tip of the sceptre, and the king says to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom." She survived the approach. The sceptre is extended, and now she must speak. But Esther does not immediately reveal her purpose. A person expecting her to simply pour out the whole story of the decree, and Haman and the Jewish people might be surprised by her response. "If it pleases the king," she says, "let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." She invites them to a banquet. Just the king and Haman and the queen. A dinner. The king immediately sends for Haman, and they come to the feast that Esther has prepared. And as they are drinking wine after the feast, the king again asks Esther what her petition is, saying that it shall be granted to her even to half his kingdom. And again, Esther does not yet reveal the full weight of what she carries. "My petition and my request," she says, "is if I have found favour in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfil my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." She's inviting them to a second banquet, 2 dinners, 2 opportunities to build the context, to ensure the king is comfortable and open and favourably disposed, before she reveals what she actually needs. This is not weakness or procrastination. This is strategy. Esther understands the man she's dealing with and the environment she's operating in, and she's creating the best possible conditions for what must be the most important conversation of her life. Haman goes out that day joyful and glad of heart. He has been invited to dine privately with the king and queen. Twice. This is, in his understanding, the pinnacle of his social achievement, the confirmation that he stands above all others in the king's favour. He goes home, calls for his friends and his wife Zeresh, and tells them all about his riches and his many children, and all the promotions with which the king has honoured him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. He's at the height of his power as he sees it, and he needs them to see it too. Then he adds, and this is the detail that reveals everything about his psychology, that even Queen Esther let no one but himself come with the king to the feast she prepared, and tomorrow also he is invited by her together with the king. Yet, he says, all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. He cannot enjoy it. All the wealth, all the honour, all the private dinners with royalty, all of it is poisoned by the fact that one man, a minor official at the city gate, will not bow to him. His wife and friends have a simple suggestion. Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. This suggestion pleases Haman, and he has the gallows built. That night, the king cannot sleep. It is one of those simple details that changes everything. An emperor in his palace, the most powerful man in the world, lying awake in the dark with his thoughts. He commands that the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, be brought and read to him. And in those chronicles the reader being unable to sleep finds the account of Mordecai telling about Bigthan and Teresh, those two officials who had sought to assassinate King Xerxes. The king asks what honour or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this, and his servants tell him that nothing has been done for him. Nothing. The man who saved the king's life was recorded in the chronicles and then forgotten. He received no reward, no recognition, nothing. And now, years later, because a king could not sleep, because a record keeper chose this particular passage, because the chronicle happened to fall open at exactly this account, the king is suddenly, belatedly, aware of the debt, and Haman has just arrived in the outer court of the king's palace to tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on the gallows he has just built. The king's servants tell him Haman is there, and he says to bring him in. Haman enters, and before Haman can say anything, the king poses a question. What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honour? Haman, whose entire mental world at this moment revolves around himself and his grievances and his enemy, thinks to himself that the king delights to honour no one more than Haman himself. So he suggests a ritual of royal honour beyond anything previously described. Let the royal robes be brought, the robes that the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden and on whose head a royal crown is set. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let them dress the man whom the king delights to honour, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honour." The king says, quickly, "Take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." The devastation of this moment for Haman must have been total. He came to ask for Mordecai's execution. He is leaving to personally lead Mordecai through the city square on the king's own horse, proclaiming his honour before the crowd. He takes the robes and the horse and dresses Mordecai and leads him through the square of the city, proclaiming as the king commanded. Then Mordecai returns to the king's gate, and Haman hurries to his house, mourning and with his head covered. He tells his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that has happened to him, and his wise men and Zeresh's wife say to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." This is a stunning acknowledgement from Haman's own household, from the people who urged him to build the gallows. There is a recognition here of something larger than politics, a sense that what is unfolding cannot be stopped by the instruments of imperial power. While they are still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrive and hurry Haman to the feast that Esther has prepared. The second banquet. The king and Haman recline at the table with Queen Esther, and after the wine has been served, the king again asks, "What is your petition, Queen Esther?" it shall be granted you, and what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. This is the moment. Everything has been leading here. 3 days of fasting, the careful strategy of the first dinner, the sleepless night of the king, the public humiliation of Haman, and now Esther sits at a table with both her husband and her people's would-be destroyer, and the king is asking her what she wants. If I have found favour in your sight, O king, she begins, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. But we are to be wiped out. The king does not immediately understand. He asks who has done this, who has dared to fill his heart with such presumption. And Esther says, a foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king, in his rage, rises from the feast and goes into the palace garden. Haman, realizing that disaster has been determined against him by the king, stays to beg for his life from Queen Esther. He is so desperate that when the king returns from the palace garden and finds Haman has fallen on the couch where Esther is, the king misreads the scene entirely, perhaps willfully. Will he even assault the queen in my own house? The word goes out from the king's mouth, and the servants cover Haman's face. One of the king's eunuchs, Harbona, mentions as if in passing that the gallows 50 cubits high stands at Haman's house, which Haman prepared for Mordecai, who had saved the king. The king says, hang him on that. And they hang Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's anger abated. It is almost impossible not to notice what has happened here. The instrument of death that Haman constructed specifically for Mordecai becomes the instrument of his own death. He built it, named it, designated it, positioned it in his own yard and died on it. The reversal is complete, precise, and carries the quality of something that was arranged at a level beyond human planning. But the story is not finished, because the decree is still in force. Persian law, once written and sealed with the king's ring, cannot be revoked. The edict calling for the destruction of all Jews throughout the empire still stands. Haman is dead, but his legacy threatens to outlast him. The day set for the annihilation is still coming, written in stone by the laws of Persia and Media. Esther goes to the king again, this time falling at his feet and weeping and begging him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. The king extends the golden scepter to Esther again, and she rises and stands before him. She makes her plea eloquently and specifically. If it pleases the king, and if he regards her with favour, and the thing seems right before the king, and she is pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite. The king's answer reflects the nature of Persian law. He cannot revoke the decree. What is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. But he can write another decree, a new edict that allows the Jews to defend themselves, to gather and protect themselves, and to destroy the power of any armed force that might attack them. He gives his ring to Esther and Mordecai writes letters in the king's name and seals them with the king's signet ring, sending them by mounted couriers on swift horses bred from the royal stud. The letters give the Jews in every city the right to gather and defend their lives, to destroy and kill and annihilate any armed force that might attack them, to plunder their goods. When Mordecai goes out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple, the city of Susa shouts and rejoices, and for the Jews there is light and gladness and joy and honour. In every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there is gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. The appointed day comes, the 13th day of the 12th month. Throughout the empire, Jews gather and defend themselves. Those who had planned to profit from the decree against the Jews find themselves facing communities that are prepared, authorized, and fighting for their lives. The enemies of the Jews are defeated. Haman's 10 sons, who had carried forward their father's work, are killed. And on the 14th day the Jews rest and make it a day of feasting and joy. Esther sends letters to all the Jews establishing that they should keep annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as days when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday. They are to make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. This is the festival of Purim, which takes its name from the lots that Haman cast to determine the date of the Jews' destruction. The instrument of their intended annihilation becomes the name of their annual celebration. The feast is established and observed to this day, a permanent marker in the Jewish calendar of the moment when a death sentence became a deliverance. Mordecai the Jew is second in rank to King Xerxes and is great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. Esther remains queen, the Jewish people survive, and the particular shape of how it all happened, the timing, the sleepless night, the chronicle that happened to be read aloud, the gallows that Haman built for someone else, the sceptre extended rather than withheld, all of it is now part of the record. What is perhaps most striking about the Book of Esther, and what has generated centuries of theological discussion, is that the name of God does not appear anywhere in it. Not once. This is unique in the Hebrew Bible. Every other book invokes the divine name, calls on the Lord, records direct communication between the human and the holy. The Book of Esther is different. God is not mentioned. There are no miracles in the conventional sense, no burning bushes, no parting seas, no voices from the clouds. There is instead a series of events that, taken individually, might each be explained as coincidence or politics or human nature, but taken together, following as they do a particular shape and moving toward a particular conclusion, they carry the unmistakable weight of design. This is in fact one of the most sophisticated theological arguments in the entire biblical canon. The Book of Esther does not show you God. It shows you what a world looks like when God is working in it through ordinary means, through human decisions and royal protocols, and the inability of a king to sleep, and the willingness of a young woman to take an impossible risk. It says something profound about the nature of divine action in a world that does not always announce itself as sacred. It says that the fingerprints may be everywhere even when the hand is invisible. Esther herself is a figure of extraordinary complexity. She's not a prophet. She does not receive divine revelations or angelic visitors. She begins the story as a young woman who has been carefully sheltered and instructed to conceal her identity. And she moves through the narrative navigating the complicated politics of a foreign court with a combination of natural grace and deliberate strategy. She obeys Mordecai because she trusts him. She approaches the king because she has been convinced that she has no real alternative. She chooses her timing carefully, inviting her enemies to dinner not once but twice before revealing her hand. And yet, for all this political calculation, there is a moment in her story that transcends strategy. It is the 3 days of fasting before she approaches the king. Whatever else the fast represents, it represents an acknowledgement that she cannot do this on her own. She's asking for help from whatever power exists beyond her own cleverness and beauty and position. And when she emerges from those 3 days and puts on her royal robes and walks to the inner court, she's not just a queen approaching her king. She's a person who has done everything she can do and then trusted the rest to something beyond herself. The question that Mordecai asks her, whether she has come to the kingdom for such a time as this, is not merely a question about one woman's purpose. It is a question about the relationship between individual lives and larger narratives. It suggests that the details of a person's life, including the painful ones, including the orphaning and the exile, and the hiding of her true identity, may be preparation for something that only becomes visible in retrospect. The parents she lost, the people from whom she was separated, the years of keeping a secret, none of these things felt like preparation at the time, they felt like loss. But in the moment when her position and her courage and her people's need all converge, every detail of her history becomes relevant. This is a pattern that appears throughout human experience. The way that things that seemed merely unfortunate or inexplicable later reveal themselves to have been necessary. The path that seemed like a detour was the road. The delay that felt like abandonment was timing. The weakness that seemed disqualifying was the precise thing that created the empathy needed for the work. Esther's story does not suggest that suffering is good or that loss is simple. It suggests that nothing is necessarily wasted, that the accumulation of a life, even a difficult one, may be moving towards something that requires every part of it. Haman represents something that also appears throughout human experience, the way that wounded pride, when it is given power, becomes capable of enormous destruction. He is not presented as someone who began with genocidal intentions. He is presented as a man who received an honour that he believed entitled him to universal deference, and who encountered one person who would not give it. And from that single refusal, from the inability of one minor official at the city gate to bow, Haman extrapolated an entire people's unworthiness to live. The logic of wounded pride is always like this. It cannot rest with the individual who offended it. It has to explain the offence as something structural, something that reflects a category of people rather than a particular person's choice. If it were just about Mordecai, Haman might have found a way to have him quietly removed. But because it is about Haman's own sense of entitlement and significance, it has to become about something bigger. And yet, for all his power, for all the king's ring and the sealed decree and the gallows he built, Haman falls in the precise shape of his own design. He is destroyed by the mechanism he created. The gallows for Mordecai receives Haman. The decree for the Jews' destruction becomes the context for a counter-decree that defeats his forces. His name, which he sought to elevate above all others, survives in the historical record specifically as the name of a villain. The thing he most wanted, to be permanently honoured, is achieved only in permanent infamy. Mordecai, by contrast, is a man whose patience is almost inhuman in its quality. He raises an orphan with care and attention. He sits at the city gate day after day, keeping watch over a young woman who has entered a world where he cannot follow her. He refuses to bow to a man whose title would seem to demand it, not in defiance for its own sake, but out of a fidelity to something he considers more fundamental. He communicates with Esther through intermediaries, sending messages through the walls of a palace. And when the crisis comes, he does not pretend to know exactly how things will unfold. He only knows that silence is not an option, that if relief and deliverance come from another place, they will come, but that there is also something that Esther herself must decide. His most famous words are framed as a question, not a command. Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The question format is itself significant. He is not claiming to have divine knowledge of Esther's purpose. He is offering a possibility, a framework for understanding her position that might help her find the courage to act. He is saying, what if all of this has been preparation? What if the meaning of your story is about to become visible? He does not know. He is inviting her to consider the possibility, and that is, in many ways, more powerful than a direct command would be, because it places the decision where it belongs, in Esther herself. The festival of Purim, established at the story's end, is an act of intentional memory. Human communities that have experienced trauma or deliverance face a recurring challenge. How to remember what happened in ways that remain vivid and meaningful to generations who did not experience it. The Jewish answer, here as elsewhere in the tradition, is to make the remembering itself a feast, a celebration, a social event that binds community together around the memory. Purim is celebrated with feasting and drinking, and the exchange of gifts and the giving of portions to the poor. It involves reading the Book of Esther aloud, with the congregation making noise to drown out Haman's name every time it is mentioned. It involves costumes and humour, and a deliberate inversion of the solemnity that might otherwise accompany a story about near extermination. This is wise. The story of Esther is, among other things, a story about the reversibility of what seems irreversible, about the way that what appears to be an ending can be a turning point. The Purim celebration enacts this reversal theatrically. Mourning turns to gladness. Sorrow becomes a holiday. The name associated with death is drowned in noise. The community rehearses year after year the memory of a time when everything seemed lost and then was not. For people living in exile, as the Jewish community was during the period of Esther's story, this kind of memory is not merely historical. It is functional. It keeps alive the understanding that present suffering is not the final word, that the powerful do not always prevail, that the decree that seems irreversible may meet a counter-decree, that a young woman who reveals her identity at the right moment can change the fate of a people, that the gallows built for one person may receive another, that the king who cannot sleep may open a chronicle at exactly the right page. The story is about the structure of hope, the way that hope is not optimism, not the belief that things will certainly work out, but the refusal to treat the current moment as the final one. Esther herself, as a figure of leadership, offers something that more traditionally heroic narratives often miss. She is not superhuman. She's afraid when she approaches the king uninvited. She is careful and strategic in how she reveals her purpose. She uses the tools available to her, her position, her relationship with the king, her skill in human interaction, rather than relying on some power that transcends her situation. She's working within the system rather than outside it, using the protocols of the court rather than breaking them. And this is, in many ways, the most realistic kind of courage, the kind that takes the world as it is and looks for the place within it, where a person can do what must be done. There is also something important in the fact that Esther's identity is hidden for most of the narrative. She's been living at the intersection of two worlds, the Persian court and the Jewish community, carrying both without advertising the combination. This experience of holding multiple identities, of knowing oneself to belong to a people, and a tradition that is not the dominant one in the environment where one operates, is familiar to many people throughout history and in the present. The management of this double life is exhausting and sometimes dangerous, but it also creates a particular kind of awareness, a sensitivity to the gap between how things appear and how they actually are, between the public performance of life and its private reality. When Esther finally reveals her identity, the moment is not only personally significant, it is the thing that makes justice possible. The king cannot help people he does not know are in danger. He cannot respond to a threat he has not been told about. Esther's revelation is the act that makes the king's power available for the right purpose, rather than the wrong one. She does not merely save her people by speaking up. She connects the king's power to the actual situation, providing the information that allows him to redirect his authority. This is, in miniature, a model of how change often happens in institutions and systems, not through external pressure alone, but through someone within the system choosing to reveal what they know, to name what is happening, to make visible what has been invisible. The Empire of Persia, in the Book of Esther, is not portrayed as evil in itself. It is portrayed as a system that can be used for either destruction or protection, depending on whose agenda currently controls it. Haman directed the system toward annihilation. Esther and Mordecai redirect it toward preservation. The king himself, not a particularly thoughtful or morally discerning figure in the narrative, is capable of both signing the decree against the Jews and signing the counter-decree that gives them the right to defend themselves. He is moved by the last person who made a persuasive argument in his presence. This is not admirable, but it is familiar. And the story acknowledges that working within such a system requires understanding how it works, rather than expecting it to operate by higher principles than it actually has. What endures from the story is not primarily a lesson in political strategy, though the political dimensions are genuinely instructive. What endures is something more personal and more universal. It is the image of a person at the edge of a decision, standing in royal robes outside a throne room, knowing that what happens next is genuinely uncertain, and choosing to step forward anyway. If I perish, I perish. These 4 words carry the entire weight of moral courage. They acknowledge the reality of danger. They refuse to let that danger be the deciding factor. They recognise that there are things more important than personal safety, that the claims of community and conscience in this particular moment in history are more pressing than the understandable desire to protect oneself. Every person who has ever stood at such a threshold, facing a decision whose outcome is genuinely uncertain, where action could cost them something real and silence would be the safer path, encounters something of themselves in Esther's story. The specific context is ancient Persia. The form is royal protocol and imperial decree. But the interior experience of weighing risk against responsibility, of receiving the challenge that suggests your whole life has been preparation for this moment, of finding the courage to believe that even if the worst happens, it is still better to act than to be silent. This is not historical. This is permanent. The book closes with Esther and Mordecai established in positions of influence, the Jewish people preserved and celebrating, and the festival of Purim founded as an annual memory. But before it closes, it quietly notes that God's name is still not there. The preservation of an entire people has been accomplished through human courage, human strategy, human relationships, and whatever it is that guides a king's sleeplessness toward a particular page in the Chronicles on a particular night. The story does not demand that you call this providence. It simply shows you what providence might look like when it declines to announce itself. And it leaves you with a question that has no final answer, but has animated human reflection for thousands of years. Looking at your own life, at the particular collection of circumstances and losses and skills and positions that constitute your story, is it possible that some of what seemed merely to happen to you was actually preparation for something that has not yet arrived? Is it possible that the moment for which you have been positioned, perhaps without knowing it, is still approaching? Is it possible that even now, in whatever ordinary day you occupy, there is a sleepless king somewhere who is about to open a chronicle, and that what happens next depends on whether you are willing to put on your royal robes and walk toward the threshold? Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The question hangs there, patient and open, the way that the most important questions always do, not demanding an answer, not promising that the answer will be comfortable or safe, simply asking, simply wondering, simply suggesting that the story, your story, may be larger and stranger and more carefully arranged than you have yet understood. And in that wondering, in that openness to the possibility that the ordinary details of an ordinary life may be moving towards something that has not yet become visible, there is something that functions very much like hope, not certainty, not a guarantee, but the refusal to close the book before the last page has been written, the willingness to remain present to the story you're in, because the story you're in may be exactly the one that needs you in it. The city of Susa, in the end, is glad. The Jewish communities in 127 provinces breathe again. Mordecai walks through the streets in blue and white, crowned with gold. Esther sits in the palace she entered as an orphan with a secret and rules, now as a queen whose identity is known, and whose courage is part of the record. And somewhere in all of that, in the gap between what was planned for destruction and what actually happened, in the space between Haman's gallows and Mordecai's horse, in the reversal of the decree, the overturning of the verdict, the survival of the condemned, there is something that the text declines to name but that every reader feels. It is the sense that behind the visible machinery of empires and decrees and court politics and human pride and human fear, something else is also operating. Something patient, something precise, something that works through the courage of one young woman and the stubbornness of one old man at the gate, through the sleeplessness of a king and the timing of a chronicle, through the very pride of a villain which becomes the instrument of his undoing. Something that does not need to announce itself to be real. The Book of Esther does not tell you what to call that something. It only shows you what it looks like when it is at work, and then it establishes a feast and says, remember this. Every year, remember this. Eat and drink and give to one another and give to the poor and make noise when the enemy's name is spoken. And remember that what seemed irreversible was reversed, that what seemed certain was undone, that the night that looked like the end turned out to be the night before the turning. Remember that there was a young woman who stood at the edge of a throne room and said, If I perish, I perish. Remember that she did not perish. Remember that the people she carried into that room with her, hidden in the story she told the king over wine and a carefully prepared dinner, they did not perish either. Remember that the moment required exactly the person who was there, and then ask yourself, quietly, in whatever ordinary circumstances you inhabit right now, whatever palace or gate or ordinary room you occupy, what moment might be requiring exactly you? What truth you might be positioned to speak that no one else in your particular situation can speak? What people might be waiting, without knowing they are waiting, for whatever courage you have been all this time, through all of it, quietly preparing,